Good evening and welcome to this evening's study session of the City Council. Agendas for study sessions, including concept reviews, can be found by visiting Broomfield's website at www.broomfield.org. Our agenda this evening includes one study session item. Although public comment is not taken on study session items, correspondence sent to council by the deadline has been reviewed and added to the public record, providing the public with the opportunity to engage in tonight's session. The public may attend tonight's meeting and future council meetings in person at the George D. Sierra City and County Buildings Council Chambers located at 1 Tacoma Drive, or watch live on Channel 8 and through live streaming on Broomfield's website. Before we begin this evening's discussion, we want to take a moment to honor the heroes we lost in the horrific shooting in Arvada. Please join me in a brief moment of silence for Officer Gordon Beasley, Johnny Hurley, and their family. Thank you. You will never be forgotten. We would also like to take a moment to update you on the recent community survey many of you were asked to take this spring. The survey is conducted every 3 years with the National Research Center. Staff is eager to share the results with council and residents at the upcoming July 27th council meeting. The results demonstrate that not only did our community survive the pandemic, we banded together and thrived. Thank you for making Broomfield such a wonderful and active place to live, work, and play. Additionally, today, the City and County of Broomfield was named the 5th healthiest community in the United States by the U.S. News and World Report. Congratulations, Broomfield. By working together to prioritize the public health and safety of our community, we are consistently ranked in the top 5 year after year. Finally, Broomfield has welcomed new staff over the past few months. On behalf of council, we want to honor and thank the staff that has carried a very heavy load over the past year. We couldn't have done it without the dedicated staff of Broomfield. We're also excited to grow the Broomfield team. If the new staff will please come to the podium and introduce yourselves, their position, and their department. Oh, can we get the mic on?
Erica Delaney Lou, excuse me, I'm the city and county clerk. I'm not new to Broomfield. As many of you know, I've been with Broomfield for 12 years, but I'm new to this role. So thank you very much.
Nancy Anzulis, administrative analyst. I work in the manager's office. Been there for 4 years, but with Broomfield for 15. Kelly Cole, and starting tomorrow in the city manager's office. I've been with Broomfield for 13 years in different capacities, and I'm very excited to start a new role.
Hello, I'm Jeff Schreier. I'm the business development lead in your economic vitality department, and I started at the beginning of the month. I'm very excited for all the work we're going to do together. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Kyle Mason. I'm the emergency manager for the City and County of Broomfield, and I'm in the city manager's office.
Good evening. I'm Kari Hunt, deputy director of Health and Human Services.
Good evening, J.D. Mashta, I'm going to be the new assessor. I've been here, I will be 20 years in July 16th, and I look forward to it. And I want to give a shout out to Cindy, who is retiring now.
Good evening, Mayor and members of council. I'm Kimberly Dahl. I'm your new public works director and have been with Broomfield almost 3 years now. Thank you.
Good evening, Nikki Macklin, Director of Human Resources, and I've been here just under 3 months now.
Good evening. I'm Nikki Kraus, the new Senior Services Manager with Parks, Recreation, and Senior Services. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Bachman. I'm the municipal judge. I've been at the role for about 2 months, and before that, it was the county court judge for about 14 years. Nice to see everyone.
Good evening, I'm Evan Linsley, and I'm joining the finance department as the assistant director, and I am incredibly excited to join in a couple of weeks now. So, thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to the team. And thank you for joining us this evening. Welcome to Broomfield. We look forward to working with you all. We'll now move into this evening's agenda. Our first and only item is a review of policy enforcement of camping in public spaces. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, and I'll ask our staff to begin the discussion.
Thank you, Mayor, and good evening, Council. This is probably one of the most difficult conversations that you all are about to embark on. It checks every single box, every human emotion that is relative to equity and goodness and enforcement. This is one of the very few issues that we are not, from a staff perspective, coming to you with options or answers, but rather seeking guidance on existing ordinances and policy and what that means. It's from a national perspective, a state perspective, a local perspective. Every day, there isn't a day that goes by that we don't open the newspaper, that additional sweeps and or enforcement and or some type of all of the above are occurring. Most recently, I'm sure you read about what's happening in the city and county of Denver, but closer to home, what's happening imminently in Boulder. And those sweeps will no doubt impact Broomfield, and we're anticipating that to occur within 5 to 7 days. That said, we have a multitude of staff that are here that have, if I say worked tirelessly, it really doesn't incorporate the work that this staff has done. It's been a harrowing journey, and it is one that at the end we did not all end up seeing eye to eye. Again, it's ideologically challenging when we try to always keep what's best for Broomfield in the forefront of our minds. And then we mix that with our own backgrounds and experience and weight from a staff perspective that any type of decision or policy movement that we have will directly impact all of us. With that, we have Chief Krieger. I don't have my glasses on. I was telling Abby today, it gets worse and worse every single day. So now I can't see far and I can't see up close, but I carry my readers. Chief Gary Krieger will introduce the conversation, walk us through various components. We have Kristen Pritz here from Open Space and Trails. We have Clay Shuck, Director of Parks, Rec, and Senior Services. And as I look out, we have Dan Casey from Health and Human Services, Kari, who brings with him such deep knowledge that we are so grateful for, and the timing just couldn't have been better. So Kari Hunt is also here, the Deputy Director of HHS. Anea Hempelman, who's the Deputy Chief, also taking a lead role in these conversations. And then, of course, Christina Penn and Nancy Rogers with regards to the legal component. Chief Krieger, please introduce us to what we're about ready to talk about, please.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Hoffman. Good evening, Mayor and Council. We've been working on this quite a bit, and so we're going to break this full discussion of homelessness up into a couple different sessions. And all of us know that homelessness is somewhat individualized, right? So you have to approach it from an individual standpoint. But we have to put them in typologies, and we use some of the National Housing Institute classifications for kind of the groups, and the group we're gonna work with tonight and talk about is the most difficult to deal with. So if we could have the next slide. So these are the typologies that you see in homelessness. The use of a iceberg is actually quite important because the chronic is the one that is most visible. It's the one you guys are hearing about from your constituents. It's also the most difficult to deal with. And it's also where the legal waters are a little bit muddy on. We will deal with the episodic, the transitional, the hidden, and the at-risk at the 29th meeting. Those are the ones where our services that we have through HHS and our nonprofit partners are most effective in dealing with. But the chronic is probably our most difficult. And as Ms. Hoffman just explained to you, you're seeing in Denver, in fact, there's a news story out today that Denver estimates that its homeless population has increased threefold in the last 10 years, most of that in less time than that. Because of that, Denver's pushing and doing the cleanups, and that's pushing it outward. Similarly, Boulder's doing some cleanup and moving people, and that's pushing. So we don't have exact numbers for you right now, but Dan Casey can provide you with sort of some of the historic data that we have. Next slide, please. So what is the chronically homeless? Well, U.S. Department of Housing has this definition, but it's most typically the people that are visible on the streets. They're the people camping. They typically have had a lot of interaction with social services and various other things that can provide them help. They're very knowledgeable of when to get help and when they want it. But they also have the most difficult to get housed because of a lot of reasons. And so they'll purposely choose, in a lot of cases, to remain in the camping and unhoused. A lot of them will be frequent users of shelters, especially when it's cold, but most of them prefer camping over shelters for a variety of reasons because they're general living dynamic. Some of the top reasons we hear about is pets. Shelters will not allow pets in the shelter, and they don't want to give up their pet to a pet shelter or anything like that because they can't get it back. And so they oftentimes will not go to shelter because of pet. There's often rules with shelters. There has to be for the safety of everybody in the shelter. But they generally have a large amount of them either have mental health or substance abuse problems. They aren't allowed to use substances or alcohol in the shelter. And so they will purposely choose that they will not go into the shelter. They're fearful of loss of their belongings. They have a lot of stuff. You imagine taking your household with you everywhere you go. But shelters can't allow them to bring all that stuff in. So they'll have to leave it out on the street or someplace else, and then they become victims of that. So they are often very afraid of using a shelter, except for when it's an emergency, like it's really cold. They're very good at knowing when they need food, how they get food. They know how, if it's a super cold night out and they need protection, they know where to get those. If they become ill, they usually know how to get that. It's because they've done this for a long time and they're pretty adept at getting through that. Next slide, Jake. Here's just kind of some of the things that are typical of this typology. They have high barriers to employment. Usually it's the drug, alcohol, substance abuses, and some of the mental health issues. But most of them don't have mental health issues to the extent that the police department can place them on mental health hold. They're not a danger to themselves, an immediate danger to themselves or others. They just have a long history of mental illness. But they will suffer also from other physical disabilities. Sometimes that's an impediment to employment. And then, the substance abuse and addiction is a horrible thing. But all of us know that until you're ready to get off of the abuse or off of the substances, it's very difficult for even the best of services to get you there. You got to want to do that. Again, about 80% struggle with the alcohol and drug abuse. Again, this is only the chronic category. So I want to make that very clear. This is the chronic category. The addiction is an enormous barrier for them for self-sufficiency. And because of that, they'll have frequent contacts with law enforcement. Generally here in Broomfield, we will know who our chronic homeless are. We'll have fairly frequent contact with them. I brought Commander Weirquist with me, who kind of oversees one of our patrol divisions, and he's kind of heads that piece. He's on all the boards for homelessness with a lot of our partners, and he can kind of give you kind of a real world of what we're seeing out there. But they are highly dependent on social services and governmental assistance for their day-to-day survival. So again, it's that kind of dichotomy. They prefer to live in camp, but they do have to depend on services for their day-to-day survival. Next slide. Now I'll turn it over to the city attorney's office and I'll be back here in a minute.
Good evening, council. Nancy Rogers, your city and county attorney. Here with me this evening is Christina Pena Helm. We're going to spend the next few slides giving a legal class on this issue of the laws that are impacting unhoused individuals and specifically camping. The information that we're presenting is more of a legal class. It's based on publicly available information, published cases, different than attorney-client privileged information that we would present to council specific to Broomfield. So it's just going to be an overview, and then we'll have time for questions after our slides are done. I want to go over the code provisions first. Broomfield has a camping restriction. It prohibits camping in any park without first having obtained a permit, therefore from the director of Parks and Rec. So there is a camping prohibition on the books. This ordinance has been in effect since 1977. And a park is defined, and I want to go through each word here because this is, as we're seeing in the cases, where we get into a lot of factual circumstances and picking apart definitions. What is the definition of open space? What is the definition of park? So a park for this code provision is defined as park, reservation, playground, rec facility, or other open space owned, leased, or under the control of the city, which is devoted to recreation and leisure time used by the public. So there's a lot of words that are open to interpretation. I know we got a question by a council member of what is a resident? What is member of the public mean? And there's various definitions depending on what you're looking at. If you're looking at the voting laws, if you're looking at our ordinances, and if you're looking at a general definition of what the public means pretty much anyone. So there's other cities regulate or ban camping outright in their codes. And you can see the long list of other communities that we have in the state that ban camping at some level. And you'll see communities where I imagine you've also seen encampments. So the existence of a ban or a code provision itself doesn't automatically mean this issue is addressed. Next slide, Jake. When we're talking about the applicable code provisions for Broomfield, we've touched on the first one, that there is a prohibition on camping or lodging without first getting a permit on parks. We also have hours when parks are open and trespassing. And you can have a trespassing on public land and public buildings. Those are all summons. Those are addressed by summons. Those aren't necessarily traditionally arrestable offenses, right? This is not something that we tend to detain somebody a long time for. The police department wouldn't. It is a minor infraction, a municipal infraction that's handled by a summons when the person appears in court. We have a code provision on lost abandoned property. Christina's going to talk about some cases involving the seizure of property. This is where this code provision for Broomfield would come into play. It's not a criminal part of our code. It's just an informational part of our code guiding how police deal with lost, abandoned, or stolen or confiscated property. And then we also have a prohibition on loitering that's not specific to parks or open spaces. It's really specific to certain behaviors or loitering near school grounds. And again, that's responded to with a summons, not necessarily hands-on removal, seizure, and arrest. Next slide. Broomfield doesn't have a code provision as to other public land. So the Broomfield's prohibition on camping is specific to parks as it's defined in that code. But there's a lot of other green space or other potential camping space that the city owns where there is no prohibition in the code. So as council is considering next steps, a code revision in this area is a possibility because there's medians, there's rights of way, there's sidewalks, there's the plaza area right out front of the building. There are 26 Colorado cities that have some sort of citywide camping ban that apply to all municipal owned land. So this is we have a model if council would like to look at those. But enforcement varies. Again, the list of who has one on the books is very different than if it's utilized to enforce and address this issue, and if that's done successfully. As for private property, Broomfield does not have a code provision restricting camping on private property, and which might seem odd first blush, but Fort Collins does. And Fort Collins was recently challenged for its ordinance that restricts allowing camping on private property. And as an as-applied challenge for that person who got the ticket in that case, the court overturned that the application of that ordinance to that person. Did not overturn the law, so Fort Collins's ordinance on private property is still in the books, can still be enforced, but as applied to that one individual, it was found to be unconstitutional for that person. Next slide. Before I turn it over to Christina to talk specifically about some of the cases, which are important because the facts matter, and that's how we're seeing these play out nationwide. We don't have a clear understanding of the, well, let me start over. The case law is in flux. We're seeing a variety of decisions nationwide on camping, on issues of addressing criminalization of homeless individuals or the unhoused. It really depends on what district you're in. Christina will talk about a case out of the Ninth Circuit, and then we're seeing strict enforcement coming out of Texas. So it's all over the board right now, which means there is no legal definitive answer on this issue. Court decisions throughout Colorado and throughout the nation are very fact specific, and the Fort Collins case is a great example of that. Courts usually focus on two important issues. Was there notice that this was going to happen to this individual who's utilizing public land, arguably in a way that violates a local ordinance? Was there notice to that person and a chance for them to comply? And then what was the basis for the government's decision to clean up? If you saw the articles today coming out of Denver, a lot of people are saying the basis for the reason to clean up is because, thank you, the All-Star game is coming to town. Versus some of the health and safety reasons that were utilized during COVID as a basis for some of the cleanups. But these are the factors that the courts look at. Other consideration, are there reasonable alternatives? Are you moving somebody to a worse situation? Is there any bed? Is there any place for that person to get shelter if they're moved from their current location? The manner by which property is dealt with. And there's property rights involved that Christina will talk about. There's personal property and like Fourth Amendment issues, and the process to allow somebody to reclaim their property and make sure we're giving high value to that property because it is that individual's personal property. So with that, I will turn it over to Christina, who's going to go into a little more detail on those constitutional issues. Next slide, please.
In the next couple of slides, we're going to look at constitutional provisions and case law that is relevant when analyzing enforcement relating to homelessness. And we're going to start off with the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and specifically prohibits the government from imposing unduly harsh penalties on criminal defendants. And in a couple slides, we'll see how this plays out in recent case law. The Fourth Amendment prohibits the unlawful search and seizure of not only a person, but also personal property. And personal property, even when it is located on public places, is protected by the Fourth Amendment. The focus of government actions under the Fourth Amendment is always whether the government acted reasonably. So therefore, the search and seizure of property from an encampment must be reasonable. And reasonableness is measured from an objective standard and looks at the degree of intrusion by the government and the manner in which that intrusion was conducted. The 14th Amendment has different components. One of them is due process, the due process clause, which in this instance relates to notice, and whether there was sufficient notice and due process given to individuals before doing a camp cleanup and removing their property. Next slide. Another component of the 14th Amendment is the Equal Protection Clause. And in homelessness cases, this has included allegations that the government targets homeless individuals for their homelessness status. And for conduct that isn't considered criminal if done by others who are not homeless. So in other words, there's been allegations that governments have selectively enforced laws against homeless individuals. The use of force under the 14th Amendment and Colorado law is also a consideration when analyzing enforcement of homelessness. And that is because enforcement of no camping laws could result in force being used by officers who are conducting that enforcement. It is well settled case law that when force is used, the court looks at the totality of the circumstances of each specific circumstance to determine if the force was reasonable in that circumstance. And the analysis in case law includes looking at various factors. And those factors include whether the severity of the crime at issue, whether the suspect posed an immediate threat to the safety of the officers or others on the scene, and whether the suspect is actively resisting arrest or attempting to flee. Force is also addressed in Colorado's recent 217 law and includes a definition or a mandate of when officers can use force. And under that law, officers may only use force if non-violent means would be ineffective to make an arrest, prevent an escape, or prevent the immediate or imminent threat of serious bodily injury or death to either the officer or another person on the scene. Next slide, please. For the next couple of slides, we're going to look at some recent case law that Nancy mentioned. These cases have been previously provided to council, but we'll just do a quick overview of them here. The Martin versus City of Boise case is an important case. It comes out of the 9th Circuit, and just as a quick reminder, Colorado is in the 10th Circuit, but this case has had wide implications and has been popping up in a lot of case law that we've been seeing. In the Boise case, there's an ordinance that prohibits sleeping and camping on public property. 6 individuals who were experiencing homelessness in Boise alleged that they were cited for violating the city's ordinance and challenged the constitutionality of that ordinance. The district court in Idaho and the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals agreed that the ordinance violates the 8th Amendment, specifically finding that it imposed criminal sanctions against homeless individuals for sleeping outdoors on public property when they had no alternative shelter to go to. There was no alternative shelter available to those individuals. This Boise case was litigated for over 12 years. And just in February of this year, a settlement was reached where Boise agreed to invest over $1 million to address homelessness issues, and also agreed to not cite or arrest people who are experiencing homelessness when there are no shelter beds available. And like I said, although this case is not a 10th Circuit case that is directly binding on Colorado, it has been cited in several Colorado cases, including the next case, which is the Weimold versus City of Fort Collins case. In this case, Mr. Weimold was sleeping in his car at a rest stop that was owned by the state. And he was in a 2-hour parking spot where camping would not be allowed. The state asked the Fort Collins Police Department to enforce the camping on public property law. And Mr. Weimold was cited for a violation of that ordinance. This is one of those factually real specific cases because The court, listened to the evidence, heard the testimony, and found that based on the evidence, shelter was unavailable to Mr. Weimel that night, the night he was cited, because there were no shelter beds available in Fort Collins, and because he was a shelter supervisor at one of the shelters in Fort Collins, and that shelter prohibits his interactions with other clients. So not only were there no shelter beds, but there were work policies that restricted him from even staying in one of the shelters. The court found that based on those facts, Mr. Weimel's homelessness was involuntary, and that the application of Fort Collins ordinances to him was unconstitutional because he had no other alternatives that night. The court additionally ruled that it was cruel and unusual punishment based on the analysis in that Boise case to punish him for sleeping outdoors. Next slide. The next case is a case out of Denver, a recent case. In Denver has ordinances that makes it unlawful to camp on private and public property. Mr. Burton was a homeless man that was camping in Denver, and he was ticketed for violating the camping ban, specifically camping on public property. Mr. Burton pled not guilty and argued that the ordinance that was applied to him violated the 8th and the 14th Amendment, and he asked that his citation or his criminal case be dismissed. The county court, who first heard the case, relying again on the Martin versus Boise case, found that that Denver's ban was unconstitutional because it targeted homeless based on their homeless status. The city of Denver appealed this to the district court, and the district court disagreed with the county court and found that this case, and again, based on the facts of this case, that it was different than the Boise case because Mr. Burton was offered shelter before he was cited, but he refused that shelter. The court also found that the ban was facially constitutional because the ordinance applied to anyone, not just specifically to homeless people who might decide to camp on public property. The next case is also a case out of Denver. This is a case that's in the federal court, the U.S. District Court in Denver. And in this case, a homeless action group, along with several individuals who are experiencing homelessness, filed a lawsuit and also a motion for an injunction to stop Denver, in their view, from continuing to do cleanups without proper notice or reason. There was an extensive hearing that was held on that issue. And the judge in that case issued an order requiring Denver to give specific notice. So the Denver is required now, among other things, to give a 7-day notice before cleaning any encampment and 2 days notice when the cleanup is for the purpose of a camp that has been deemed to be dangerous to public health. One thing to remember about this case is it's not binding on anyone else except for Denver. The injunction was just against Denver, but it is something to look at as to what the judges would look at in these types of cases. We're going to pause there to see if you have any questions based on that part of the presentation.
Thank you, Mayor. So I just want to make sure that I understand a couple of key points that the chief talked about, as well as the legal aspect. I'm not sure how to frame my question, so give me a second. We're talking about the chronic, the most visible, most difficult category, typology, I think is the word that the chief used, of homelessness. And I guess one of the things that struck me in the presentation on the legal issues was the severity. which court case talked about the severity of the crime as a factor looked at by the courts? You just mentioned that, I think, Ms. Pinham.
So that was the analysis of whether force that's used by an
Okay.
officer is reasonable in the circumstances.
Okay, so, I guess I have a question because to a certain extent, when we talk about the severity of the crime, camping doesn't, or sleeping outside doesn't feel like it's a very severe crime, but we're really talking about potentially a whole suite of associated behaviors. Am I making any sense? I don't feel like I am. It's in my head, it's very muddy. Chief, you look like you have something to say?
So again, the severity of the crime comes up. For example, if a plaintiff brings a lawsuit and says that excessive force was used against them by an officer in a certain situation. So it's possible, right? If there's enforcement of a camping ban against the person and the officers are the ones who are the enforcers, that if the person resists or becomes dangerous, then the officer would have to use force. Then what the court would look at is whether that force was reasonable. And then those three factors, one of them, which includes the severity of the crime, is one of the factors to look at whether that force was reasonable in that situation.
I see, okay, that makes a lot more sense than the road I was going down in my head. Chief, did you have something you wanted to add?
Sure, it helps. To put a little context behind it, think of being thrown out of your home. You know, where these people are living, it's their home. And so the camping ban is a relatively minor offense. It's a municipal offense, punishable by a fine. But removal or making them move means you're invading their home, taking their stuff and pushing them out. And that's where this particular case law becomes very important because people will generally defend their home, and leading to force and arrest and incarceration, because now we're starting to get into higher level crimes, which is what we're trying to avoid.
I see. Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you very much. Then I wrote down one other. So explain a little bit more to me the case law. Here, the one you have up, the People versus Burton, where Mr. Burton was offered a shelter space and refused it. Why is that so critical to that case?
That's critical because one of the factors the courts are looking at, again, looking at that Martin versus City of Boise case, is whether there's alternatives that can be offered to a person before enforcing a no camping ban. If there are alternatives, even if they don't take it, that's a factual analysis to look at, because in those cases, generally, as we've been seeing, enforcement, it wouldn't be unconstitutional to enforce a no camping ban against that person. However, if there's no alternative, if the shelters were full, for example, or if there's no shelters available, then the question is whether it's unconstitutional to enforce a no camping ban against that person because they don't have anywhere else to go.
So when you say no beds available in the shelter or no shelters available, my guess is the case law hasn't graded this, sliced it as finely as I'm asking, but are we talking about beds for one night or transitional housing? Or I don't think we've gotten, it doesn't sound like this case law is that granular, is that right?
I would say that the case law that we presented tonight looks at the day or night that they were cited and looks at the data for that day or night, whether that person had an alternative that day or night of the citation.
So you could, a person chronically homeless could have this situation over and over again, and the city could be in the same situation of with enforcement of going into this over and over and over again if shelter beds were not available. I feel like I'm thinking out loud and not making a lot of coherent statements, but do you understand what I'm saying?
Sure, it's very possible, and actually happened in the Denver cases, where there's more than one incident that's being looked at, or more than one cleanup. I think in the Denver Homeless Out Loud case, there was actually 4 cleanups that were being looked at. And so each of those 4 separate incidents have different facts to look at and different considerations that the court would look at.
Fair enough. Thank you. That's all I have, Mayor.
Thank you. Now we have our first hybrid meeting going on tonight, and Councilmember Groom is attending the study session remotely. She virtually raised her hand, so Councilmember Groom?
Hello and good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. So I do have just a few questions here. I wanted to ask Chief Krieger, he made a comment earlier about how our code enforcement officers and police officers are in frequent contact with the chronic homeless. Do we have the demographics and the numbers? What does it look like for Broomfield? If we're in frequent contact with them, what are the choices they're making? Because I know you got they're offered already homeless shelters and support. What are some of the things that we're hearing back from the Broomfield homeless?
So Councilmember Groom, it's a great question. So we offer the services that are available here locally through our faith-based leaders, through our nonprofits, through our HHS. You gotta keep in mind, we don't have a homeless shelter. So there is no alternative for them other than the camping. We do okay on very, very cold nights where we can put them into a hotel room, but as hotels are opening up and going more towards business, that's a very expensive endeavor and becoming more and more difficult as an option. So that's one of our struggles in the as applied is we really don't have people camping in Broomfield except for the homeless, right? And so practically speaking, the enforcement will be on the homeless. So we run the risk of that as applied, and then as the attorney's office has explained, we don't have an option that we can show that was an option for them to camping.
So I guess my question then is my next question is in regards to your comments stating that we have no homeless shelter. I realize we don't have a physical building located in the city and county of Broomfield, but we do contract with homeless shelters. It is an option that's provided. Are you saying there's a barrier because we don't have one here in town, or we're not offering the ones that we have a contract with?
Councilmember Grimm, at this point, we don't have the contract that I'm aware of. We have been fortunate up to now to be able to use Boulder, but in some cases Denver. But
yeah.
Their problem is so big now, they don't have the beds. So we have been told that they won't accept Broomfield homeless because they simply don't have the resources to use to make that an option for Broomfield residents.
Okay, so that's news to me. I didn't realize that the contract that we had, and maybe contract is too much of a legal term, the agreement that we had, they were to hold a number of beds for Broomfield. Or maybe this is a question for the city manager. Are you telling us right now Broomfield has 0 homeless beds to offer?
Councilmember Groom, I think what you're referring to is when we had congregate beds through COVID, that we entered into a contract to hold a certain number of beds in Boulder. But we haven't had a contract to supply any coverage and or beds for homeless at the homeless shelter for a couple of years.
Okay, so that's my bad then for not knowing that contract was not secured. So thank you for that awareness. I guess my next question, and I'll move quickly, the code revision in talking about public lands. What I understood, and a simple yes or no would be great, is we need to do more refinement for what is public lands, because really our provision is only for parks as it's spelled out. Your recommendation was a code revision to identify public lands if we wanted to do that. Is that what I understood?
The code provision right now is specific to parks.
Okay.
We're not making a specific recommendation. That's an
Sure.
option, and a policy decision for council to consider.
All right, thanks. And then in the Boise case, real quickly, it mentions that there was no shelter available. Does that include a shelter that didn't allow pets, that didn't have the rules, that didn't have the fear of loss of belongings? Or was a shelter offered, but they had to follow the rules and no pets? And maybe I'm struggling with my words, like Councilmember Law Evans, I'm sorry, I'm trying to go fast here.
No,
What I'm looking for is if a shelter was offered, no shelter was available, does that mean for their situation, like if they had a dog or if they were not able to apply to the rules?
Councilmember Groom, both Christina and I are struggling on the Boise case to remember the underlying facts, and it was that type of situation. But I will point out some facts from the Fort Collins case, because Fort Collins spent a good deal of time talking about Mr. Weinhold's specific circumstances, and they looked at it's a couple pages of the decision, which means it was a long time in that hearing. They looked at, could he have driven out of town? Could he have gone to Loveland? Could he have lawfully camped on public lands elsewhere? So they looked at all types of options for him, and still decided at the end of all that there was no practical good option for him. So the court agreed with him that functionally there might have been some other options that somebody else would think was available, but for him, there was nothing else available. So like Christina had said, it gets very, very fact specific.
Sure. Okay, thank you. And I had no other questions. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Now, do we have more of the presentation to go?
We do. So if there's any other questions on the legal, but we could move back to the chief and get to his slide deck.
We'll go to Councilmember Shaft first, and we'll do that.
Thank you, Mayor. So I was glad to hear the questions regarding the alternative and what Broomfield's alternative is and clarifying that. I just wanted to point out, so I was born and raised in Boise, Idaho. It's Boise, just for everybody. That's how it's born and raised. People say it, Boise. There's no Z in the end of Boise. Just put that out there. Drives me crazy even still today, 40 years later. So one of the things that's crazy about this case is one, that it has so much precedence in growing up there and kind of living this experience. You know, the idea that the court case kept the laws on the books and allowed those laws to stay on the books, but at the same time, it upheld the rights of people who were experiencing homelessness. So there's kind of this juxtaposition there that says you were wrong to treat them in this way, but at the same time, you can keep this law on the books. So that, you know, and that seems like the other court cases are continuing that same message. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's tough. I mean, it's tough because it's the court's not necessarily giving a whole lot of direction to municipalities. And continuing to follow that case. And I mean, my parents were just here. My parents still live in Boise. And we were just talking about this very issue. Of course, I told them that we were having a conversation tonight, and they're very involved in their community in Boise, and especially with folks that are experiencing homelessness. So this is near and dear to my family's past as well as current. So the idea that you know what's happening now, so the defendants right, you know, were awarded, or there was this lump sum money, and there was conversations going to move forward. And just recently, this is like in the past few weeks, there was a homeless shelter that was proposed to be moved and increased. That homeless shelter was going to be increased, and the community revolted in these conversations. The planning and zoning office was put on hold, and now there's going to be a task force that's going to be set up to talk about this very issue that basically has been in conversations for, you know, a decade or more. So the you know, there was this task force and they're going to continue to talk about this very issue that's been in the courts for so long. So I just find that very interesting that, one, that the courts didn't necessarily deal with that juxtaposition of this. And now, the very case that all of these other ones are being held to, they're basically in no better spot, and they're going to continue these conversations about how do we deal with this.
I think that's spot on, Councilmember Schaaf. And Christina and I have seen in the conferences we go to with other municipal and county attorneys, but also in articles across the nation, nobody has figured this out, and we're not getting clear instruction from the courts on where are those bright lines. It's almost like, well, we'll know when you're doing it wrong, and we'll hold you accountable for that. But to get it right is really hard, especially when we're talking about the Bill of Rights. I mean, we are talking about some of our key constitutional rights here when we're talking about the 4th and the 14th and the 8th Amendment. So we're not getting too much instruction from the courts.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, with a lot of these camping bans, it seems like the intent is to basically push people out of the city. I mean, that was Boise's motto. Was to remove people from the city. We don't want homeless living in our city. So, the camping ban was that ability to kind of move them out. So is there anything with the intent of what those with those ordinances are? I mean, is that what the court has the issue with, is that ability for someone to not be able to live within a community?
I think we're seeing some trends coming, like similar to the Denver case that Christina talked about, where they said, hey, you can still have this law, and we understand there's good reasons why you might need to clean up a camp, but you need to give notice. You need to give a chance for compliance, and you need to treat property with respect and constitutionality so that you're not seizing it and destroying it unlawfully. So I do think we're starting to see some path forward where you can address encampments constitutionally under the law. But it takes a lot longer, right? We're talking about in Denver, they said you have to give a 7-day notice. That means for those 7 days, that camp's going to stay there and be seen. Did that hit on your question?
Thank you so much. That's all I have there.
All right, we'll continue on then. Thank you, Ms. Rogers.
Okay, so I think Councilmember Schaaf hit on what is the key issue there. So for us in the police department, DUI enforcement's easy. There's clear direction in the law. There's clear direction in the case law. We know what we need to do. We know how we're supposed to do it. We know what limits we have placed on us. And this one is particularly difficult because it's in juxtaposition, and it's difficult to know what the right way moving forward. But the risk we have is constitutional, and that could be huge in our risk and the risk for the city kind of thing. So, currently in Broomfield, we take a pretty humanistic approach to it. We will not allow them, or we'll move them or ask them to move off of parks where their playgrounds, the improved green spaces, ball fields, that kind of stuff. And we'll try and keep them out of the public eye as much as we can. So we say we check on them. We usually know where they're at. If we see them going someplace where they're going to be very visible, we'll try and get them to move. But we haven't had to do a lot of enforcement to get that done. But our problem is if it's banned in parks and open space, okay, that makes sense. But then we're just going to push them to the right of way, so they're going to become very, very visible to all of our citizens, and obviously the complaints go up. And if we push them to make it so they can't even go there, then to Councilmember Schaaf's position, in essence, that's what we have. We push them out of town, and that's going to be a problem, or could potentially be a problem. So again, the camping law was not designed for the homeless specifically, but the application of it, or as applied, is likely going to be very clear that it's going to be against the homeless, because we just don't have other people camping in Broomfield. Sometimes at the Home Depot or something like that, or the Walmart might have a few, but it's generally not a problem for us that we're seeing a ton of issues here. When it comes to, so we really try to rely on voluntary compliance and get our partners involved, see if they can provide some assistance, see if you can address those, get them the help that they need, and try and get them to move in voluntary compliance. Some of these are another option. option. We don't issue a lot of summonses for camping. To be quite honest with you, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy as far as we're concerned. So we issue a summons. We kind of saw what this typology is. They have a hard time being employed. They have high instances of drug and alcohol abuse. They have high instances of mental health. So what ends up happening, they get a ticket, they go to court, they get a warrant, and they go to jail. That's not a good place for them to be either. Because once they're arrested, now we have to take all their stuff because we're constitutionally responsible for holding and maintaining the safety of their things. It goes into our evidence vaults. A lot of it has biohazards and other problems with it that make it very difficult for my staff to handle and to deal with. Some of you may remember Kim. We dealt with Kim a lot here a few years ago until we were finally able to get her housing, but she was in and out of our jail several times until we just said, we're not going to do this anymore. Next slide. So again, one of our options is that limited enforcement based on the case law, because we can't figure out the case law. We're trying to work with our attorneys, but it's so vague for us. The limited approach is currently where we're at. We will not allow them into parks. And obviously a private property owner, if the private property owner wants them off of their property, we will legally have them removed from private property. We'll periodically again check their welfare and the condition of their encampment. You know, one of the things that we talked about is if you're going to remove an encampment, you want to make it based on public health and safety, right? We don't really have a definition of that. Really, the police are not the one to make that decision. It is, so we need to look at who's going to make that decision, what constitutes the public health. We'll do the notice and we'll assist with the cleanup and removal. And we even have processes for that. But again, that kind of that concept of at what point in time does the encampment constitute a public health hazard? You know, we always have citizen complaints on encampments and open space in the public right of way. And you guys have seen a bunch of those. I should say anecdotally, we are seeing an increase in homes in Brookfield, especially the chronic homeless. But we do not have a point in time survey as of yet to tell us the actual number. And Casey will give you some of those in just a minute. You know, again, we don't want the incarceration because we're talking about minimal offenses, right? But at some point in time, they can't just keep ignoring their summonses and not going to court. So it kind of puts us in either the summons is worthless or you have to do something about it. And then again, you know, that puts us, you know, not only the arrest, but the cleanup and stuff, they lose their homes and stuff. And then, I mean, that's just a recipe for somebody who wants to resist, quite honestly. Then when we have to do cleanup, obviously we need to have that order to evacuate. We have to make the assessment. We have to have a place to relocate them to. So if we're not going to make an arrest or issue them a ticket, we got to have a place for them to relocate to. And that's probably our number one problem because we don't have any place for them to go other than to push them out of town. Property destruction and safekeeping. Our evidence vault just can't handle the amount of stuff that comes with these. So, and plus there's biohazards and other things that are problems with some of their stuff, but it's still their stuff. It's important to them. And so we have to be able to actually work with this and figure out how to clean it, isolate it, bag it, all those kinds of things, and deal with biohazards, which have some pretty significant costs that quite honestly we don't have currently available or process available for. Next slide, Jake. So there's the summons only that we talked a little bit about in the relocation. We can do summons and mandatory relocation. I mean, we can become more aggressive in this and do a more strict enforcement, but the potential for the resistance is going to go up and the potential for the force application goes up. Remember, we're doing something that has on its face the potential for challenges constitutionally and then puts the officers at risk as well. The notification required deadlines to allow voluntary compliance. That's easy. We can put that together. We want to avoid the jail and potential incarceration because it just doesn't help. It just doesn't help. We do get them clean and sober in the jail, and we get them mental health help, but they go out and they're usually right back in to the issues that cause them to come home. And quite honestly, We try and keep them out of sight so they're not on sidewalks, public right of ways in front of City Hall or the city facilities, where they're really visible to the public. It's not a great answer, I will admit that, but every major city in the US is fighting this problem and trying to find a solution. And as much as I think all of us have researched this, none of us have found a good solution. There's a lot of resources that help with some of the others, but this group is the one that is most particularly difficult to deal with. Jake, next slide. So this is why generally I'm the police chief. I make a decision on how we're going to enforce what our next actions are. But because of the risks associated with this to the community, to the citizenry, to the city and county of Broomfield, to quite honestly my officers, I need some direction because I can't figure this out. And as you've heard, there's no real clear path forward here. And there's a lot at stake here, not only humanistically, but legally. So we have those options there. We have to figure out our mitigation and response, cleanup, the storage, release, and disposal of property. We have to be very understanding of the citizens' expectations, but they have to be realistic expectations based on the case law, and make sure we're communicating that. So, you know, I know there's a lot of people say, I didn't buy my house in Broomfield to see homes, so I want them out. Well, okay, but realistically, they have to go somewhere. People have a right to live somewhere. And then, you know, we need to figure out what our options are. If not here, where? That's really the question we need to answer is, if not here, where? Because that'll be the first question we're asking for. So I think that's our presentation in total, and we have a lot of staff here to answer questions.
Thank you, Chief Krieger. Go to Councilmember Hinkle first.
Thank you, Mayor Castriana. Thanks for this conversation. And this is, you know, the fact that we've already had 3 staff members come up here to talk about this, and we have an additional one, tells us that this is not just a one-person approach, right? So I'm thankful that we're talking about this and talking about, and if we really want to be cognizant of the land that we're on, we need to talk about, you know, the true natives that tented on this land first. So I just want to honor that tonight in our intentions. Our people who are unhoused not only deserve our attention, but they also deserve our intentions. They have been living amongst us for a long time. And now that happened, you know, some have been more seen, like you're talking about, Chief Krieger. We're just seeing it more. I'm just thankful to have this conversation, even though this issue isn't new. It sounds like from what I'm hearing from you is that I just talked to a mental health expert last week. I had lunch with her just to kind of pick her brain because she does a lot of, you know, detox, and she says, you know, rules without relationships will result in rebellion. And this is what we're looking at. So when we approach the subject, we have to approach it with the intention of developed trust and trusting relationships with our neighbors who are unhoused and not criminalizing these neighbors. So when I asked these questions last week, I wanted to know, because I did visit the Safe Outdoor Spaces, and that was a place where they have a lot of tents in one specific area. And you mentioned, you know, we have no places to put these people because you said they have pets, right? We also could have unmarried couples. Some places won't accept couples who are unmarried. And this is a, you know, a problem that we're dealing with, you know, regionally. So I'm curious as to, and they also talked about too, how it's really traumatic for people who are unhoused to be approached by different officers, and then also different officers, you know, that might look, you know, I don't know, to them to be a threat, like you talked about, like you're saying, hey, we're here, we might have to take you from your home, like they get really defensive. And I can understand why. So when we talk about this issue, I'm wondering, you know, how much of a traumatic effect it has on our police officers too, to constantly be that person that says to another person who has so much less than them. And the Safe Outdoor Spaces director, or not director, but the staff there said that it's actually traumatic for the police officers as well. So can we talk a little bit about, you know, I think this is one of the questions, and I know other places are doing different things as far as like approaching the homeless or people who are homeless, and then And then having them be approached by the same people who have those trusted relationships, because like I said, the mental health experts are telling us, we have to have these trusted relationships, with people. So, what does that look like as far as, are we going in with full kit on? Are we going in, could we go in with a polo shirt? What does that look like? I know some other counties are looking into that. And then I know I talked to Marty today at the refuge. We had a good hour and a half talk, and I know that they're starting their van up soon. We'll talk about that later.
Sure. So our officers are actually really good. Generally speaking, they know all of them by name. And again, we generally have a really good relationship with them. And I can have Commander Weirquist, who actually works with the officers on this, but we generally have a really good relationship. We won't contact them over and over again. So in fact, I was just listening the other day where, a citizen called in, and I think it was the second citizen that called in on one of our homeless, and the officer said, we've already checked on them, we're not going to check on them again. But generally speaking, unless they're in crisis where they need mental health, that's the mental health assistance, and we call our VCOR people to come out and help us. If they're highly intoxicated to the point they're, dangerous to themselves and others, then we can detox them. But generally speaking, we know where they're at. We check on them because I think you saw that they're 4 times more likely to have a 4 times higher death rate. We check on them. We don't want to find them that way. If it's cold, if it's some other weather condition, we'll check on them, see if they know. Do you have a place to go? Can you survive this cold weather? Do you need a place to go? So generally speaking, our relationship, our contacts with them has been pretty positive. And I'll ask Commander Weirquist if he wants to add anything.
Yeah, that'd be great. And Marty did talk greatly about our police department, and I thought that was really telling about how, our homeless people are treated.
Your council members appreciate the time tonight. We spend a lot of time in Broomfield really trying to pick the right policemen and women to do this job. And it's a difficult process for us here when we have to go out and continually contact these folks with the idea that we may have to force them at some point to leave where they're at or to address an issue that we don't have an answer to. Fortunately, we have great people and people who can engage in conversation and talk with these folks where they are, right? That this is for many of them a choice, and we can debate whether or not there are mental health issues that lead them to make this choice. But quite frankly, some of these folks just are not good rule followers. They don't like the social constrictions that a lot of us subscribe to, and they just choose to live this way. That clearly bumps up against our residents who pay a lot of money to live in Broomfield and don't want to have that visual reminder or just the visual image of homeless camps. And I think in fairness to our community, the people that I've talked to who've complained, and I get a lot of these phone calls, it's a concern when we start seeing the accumulation of debris and things that we would consider to be trash or rubbish. And these camps then become sort of heavy volume-wise with trash and paper and even the smallest amounts of things over time build up. And then we bring in additional health concerns related to that. It's very difficult for our officers to sort of navigate this, and I appreciate that thoughtfulness on your part, Councilman Hinkle. There's a lot of stress on cops these days for a lot of different reasons, and we're managing. We still show up to work every day to do the best job we can. But it is difficult when we don't necessarily have an answer for either side of our community. And let's be quite frank, these folks that are in house are part of our community as long as they're in Broomfield. And we don't have a great answer for them and for the folks that are paying a lot of money to live in Broomfield, or whether they pay a lot or not, it really doesn't matter. It's trying to find some way that we can come to a resolution. Quite honestly, I've been doing this now 35 years as of June 20th this year. And I have seen quite an evolution in community expectations. different cities that I've worked in, different problems that I've had to manage throughout the course of my career. And I always say it's us willow trees that survive this long because we've been with community expectations. I'm not sure what our expectation is here at this point. There's just so many different ways to look at it. And the fact that we have young men and women who are out there trying to do the right thing, I can tell you, particularly during the winter, our folks struggle when they don't have a resource to put someone up for the night. We know it's going to be very, very cold. Generally, we can find a resource, but it is difficult just to see those folks out there in those conditions. It's warmer now, and it doesn't seem to be as much of a priority to find these people places to stay because, quite frankly, they're not in any danger necessarily in the warm summer months. But we're just prolonging that problem, that decision, if we can't start having this dialogue like we are tonight. I appreciate that because the only way we're going to find an answer is to talk it through. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just one last thing. So it sounds like we have a good relationship generally with people that we're encountering. We've heard great things from the community, and I even gave kudos to you guys in an email and had great stories. I'm wondering if, because I get a lot of messages saying, hey, I saw a homeless person over here, you know, do I call 911? And so there's like this sense of like it's an emergency. And so I'm wondering if this is just maybe either a suggestion and or, you know, something to take away. I think it'd be great if we had a phone number to call. It wasn't necessarily the police hotline. You know, it could be something where, you know, a phone number to call to care for our homeless. And that might be a good way to sort of, you know, educate people as far as, you know, where does this rank on your emergency status, A. And then B, I'm wondering where the intermediary can come in where, you know, we have people from the refuge and our mental health partners and a person from HHS come out and visit them first and be that first point of contact versus the police, or what are your thoughts on that?
It's a great question. We've kind of batted this around too. Keep in mind, we try and keep really close tabs and know who we are, but they're still an unknown, right? Anytime you have somebody that may be drinking, they may be on drugs, they may be in crisis, that's an unknown. And so just to have HHS or mental health go out there and make the contact with them puts them at huge risk. I'm not sure they'd be willing to do that. I think there's value in saying, okay, if we had a police officer, vehicle close police officer, HHS worker, and maybe from somebody from mental health, go and check on it and make that assessment. Now we can make the assessment from the public health standpoint, from the mental health standpoint, as well as the legal enforcement standpoint. That makes good sense to me, and we can probably work on that. Again, though, it's when you get to that, they won't, we want them to, what options do we have, and what are we going to do, that becomes that real push-pull point. And again, there's nothing wrong with having rules in your shelters or places that are the option. We have to for the safety of everybody else. That's not really the consideration here. Just because you choose not to abide by the rules is not a good reason for you. It is, here's your option if you're in whatever location, and if you choose not to go, for whatever reason you don't, then that's what you're either going to have to go somewhere else or be enforced on. So it's that real fine balance, if you will.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And I think there's a lot of, you know, we'll get to this mental health aspect of it. I do want to push back just a little bit on, you know, it's a choice. You know, we do have a lot of people, particularly my mother who was homeless, and she traveled a lot. And because her brain would tell her, you know, there are people following you constantly, she always wanted to be on the move. And so for her, it might on the outside look like a choice, but really on the inside for her, it was life or death. So she had in her brain that people were going to hurt her. And so she was trying to keep herself safe from others. So I do want to ensure that, you know, that if we do talk about choice, it might look like it, you know, from a certain perspective. And there are some people that just want to be independent and move, you know, from place to place. But, you know, I enjoyed talking to Marty today too about the, I think it was the homeless information system. And I think as we expand upon that and look as a region, I think that'll be strong as well.
And don't get me wrong, I wasn't saying it's a choice to be homeless. I'm saying that
Right.
if you need a place to stay for the night, we have a place for you to stay. It's your choice if you choose not to use that, but now you don't get to just camp. So it's that immediate choice of, here's an option that's available to you. But the other option is not available because we now have some place that you can go.
Yeah, and that's what I would really love to see, is having a place for these people to go. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Councilmember Tessier?
Thank you, Mayor. First, I want to thank everybody who presented, and just to give a shout out to Commander Weidicrest. Your presence at the multitude of meetings, your team, you do really have the right people, and I'm very grateful. So thank you. I'm gonna get on my little cell phone for just a minute, and Councilmember Hinkle, yes, this land was home to the Arapaho, right? The Cheyenne, the Ute, and the Sioux tribe. So let's start there and acknowledge. And then I just want to read what Emma Lazarus wrote on the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. This is a really, really challenging, beautifully horrible issue. And it's a wicked problem that is defined as such because there are so many layers. It's an opportunity for Broomfield to get this done, to look at all, I don't know, I think I have like 30 different questions where I think it's a good task force of different people in the community, having residents involved, making sure that staff, council, residents, nonprofits, faith-based communities are all on the same page when it comes to this, are all engaged in the community conversations. It's not an us versus them. And last week I was in a workshop with someone who's now employed and making it one of their missions to educate people. And these are people experiencing homelessness. They're not the homeless, just like people who have problems with addiction are not addicts, right? They're people first. And when we get to know their stories, we understand maybe more of why they're doing what they're doing. We may not agree, but we at least can use our compassion. So I've been doing a lot of research, and I don't want to jump to the solution so quickly, right? Because we need to tease out a lot of what this is bringing. Homelessness, I think we all said it, it's not new. It's new to Broomfield maybe, but for the last, I don't know, couple years, at any given time, there's between 150 and 250 people who are experiencing homelessness. And that's using the data that was provided by Broomfield Fish. And I think the refuge could also attest to that. We may not like to see it, but it's here. And many organizations and advocates and people experiencing homelessness argue an affordable housing shortage is primary factor driving this growth in homelessness. Typically, we don't see encampments. Typically where we do see encampments are places where the cost of living is very, very high. And there's no doubt that the cost of living here is very, very high. So without violating amendment, the other thing I want to do is apologize to the police department for any confusion that council may have caused around to enforce, to not enforce. There was a lot of social media, and this is not about shame or blame. I'm glad we're having this conversation so we can all get on the same page. Not all encampments are drug users, right? There are many different types of encampments, and I think that we need to be mindful of that. I was talking to the Director of Human Services, Dan Casey, and, you know, what I'd like to see is maybe something set up for those that are one paycheck away of housing to housing. You know, maybe there are different categories. Marty from the Refuge, and Brookfield Fish have been, you know, looking at the people who are falling through the cracks, right? And there's a movement in Brookfield around Built for Zero, so targeting particular populations like seniors and veterans and people with disabilities. But how do we relate? How do we interact with people who maybe don't want these services? And that, I think that's as Dan Casey would say, $1 million question. What I can tell you is that we see at Brookfield Fish, there are people experiencing homelessness, and the number one thing, I shouldn't say the number one thing, what I see often is that there are a lot of people who are victims of theft and mugging, and they, through the sweeps or whatever, them losing their ID. If you don't have your ID, you can't apply for a job. You can't, you know, then you don't have an address. You could be one, you know, one person didn't have a social security card. Then you couldn't apply for a job. And then it goes on and on, right? So there are services, and what I want for Broomfield to understand is that we got to make sure that we're not putting this on just one entity. It can't be the nonprofits and the faith-based communities that take care of this. We need help from everybody. And I think there are some places, well, housing, right? Housing is an issue. Affordable housing. We can choose to exacerbate the encampments. We can choose to provide housing, and it is much cheaper to provide housing than it is to continue to deal with the vicious cycle that I think the police brought up. Let's see. So some of the research that I've been doing in Oakland, and this is something that I'd like for us to look at, community cabins. And between 2017 and early 2020, the city established 7 sites with outdoor sheds converted into 2-person tiny homes on land leased or owned by the city, housing up to 38 people at a time. Operating costs have been around $1 million per site per year, funded by the city government, the state, the private donors. I don't know what our numbers are going to look like, right? But I think maybe there's an opportunity here to talk regionally too, because everyone across the region is dealing with this. And we can't just keep kicking it down the road. This is our problem. This is everybody's problem. We are as strong as our most vulnerable. And the last thing I would like to say is that I think this is going to be a series of conversations that we have, and I'm hoping that my colleagues up here and in the community are willing to host community conversations to understand the depths of this. And we also want to keep public health and safety and welfare at the forefront. And what does that look like? And, what are other communities around here doing? And can we share costs? Can we share shelters? Can we allow pets in shelters? I know that some of the safe parking, there's many different types of safe parking. You can have safe parking for families can we have encampments for families, for those who don't necessarily, who want to change their life around? So I think that, but it's gonna take a heavy lift, and there's a lot of resources and a lot of people involved. And no one is alone in this. And so I think that those are kind of the things that I wanna add in, to this conversation. So thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember Law Evans.
Thank you, Mayor. I very much appreciate what my colleagues have already said on council, but I kind of want to bring this back to a policy discussion and the questions that were asked by staff tonight that they have asked us to answer. But the first thing I want to say is, okay, wait, I'm going to ask staff. There are two slides that I want to look at. The first one in just a moment was the slide that the chief showed about the iceberg. With the iceberg, I just love geography. So the iceberg slide, if we could look at that in a moment. And as you're bringing that up, I do want to, this is probably the most complicated discussion that we will have had as a community since the time I've been on council, which is now, as I keep saying, coming up on 7.5 years. And there are many, many different ways to approach this, many different avenues to look at it, but I think we all need to make sure that we understand that this is not a simple problem and that we're all honoring everyone involved in the problem. And having said that, I want to push back a little bit on some of the verbiage that we've talked about. I do use the term homeless rather than I'm sorry, what's the other, unhoused? Well, no, that one's okay with me. People experiencing homelessness. And this is the reason why I specifically use that terminology, is because I do not want to dishonor any individual by using language that I believe takes away their autonomy and their agency. Specifically, people experiencing homelessness denies that individual the honor of saying, you do have choices, as has been discussed tonight. They may not be what some of us would consider good choices or viable choices and whatnot, but some of you may remember when Wayne Anderson was on council. Remember Wayne? Wayne's a smart guy, and he talked about the most powerful force on earth, not in the universe above, not in the heavens above, but on earth is the power of choice. And I don't want to even use language that denies anyone that choice. So that's why I use the term homeless or unhoused as opposed to people experiencing homelessness. I want to make sure we acknowledge that everyone has some agency, some choices. So with regards to this slide that we now have up on the screen, thank you, staff. Looking at that, we are talking about, as I understand it, the focus, it says right here, the focus of tonight's discussion is on the chronic homeless. We have ample time scheduled later on for other study sessions to discuss the episodic, transitional, hidden, and at-risk populations. And I look forward to those discussions as well. But tonight, as I understand it, staff wants us to talk about the chronic homeless. And then if we could have the slide back up with the questions that staff would like answered. I want to give my best shot at those. Great, okay, super. So first of all, I want to speak directly to our police and our other staff who are involved with this. You have an incredibly difficult job. In this climate, this day and age, this has got to be something that, Chief, I would guess keeps you up at night trying to figure out the answers to this and figure out how to honor the community, how to honor the homeless, and yet how to keep your people safe and acting in what I consider to be, this is my terminology, not city, a God-honoring fashion. So I want to acknowledge the difficulty of this for the boots on ground people. It's one thing to sit up here and talk about policy and all that, but it's another thing to actually go out and be the face of Broomfield to these individuals. So I honor you, I thank you, I appreciate the job you're doing. I couldn't do it. So having said that, with regards to the enforcement approaches. These are, boy, I don't even know which to go with. I guess I'm not to the point where I can say no, I am to the point. This is what I would say with this is, let's go ahead and come up with a policy tonight. And I do like actually, I like the progression as outlined on this slide. Summons, limited enforcement, and then strict enforcement. But what I'd like to do is have potentially collaborate, and I know you already do this, but I want to just call it out, in the community have collaboration between social services and the police department to go out and go through these steps. And again, what I would say, along with the next black bullet point, is if you go through the steps as outlined as a policy, if that's what you hear from council tonight, I personally will back you 100% with regards to liability and whatnot. That's my point of view, is you go through the steps as we provide them. I commit to backing you, period. That means I realize that means chances are we're going to get sued. It doesn't sound to me like we're not going to get sued. It sounds to me like the case law is incredibly muddy. And if we have to be part of case law, if there has to be a city of Broomfield versus citizen so-and-so, then so be it. But that's my commitment as council member, is to back the people who are going through the policy. Notification and cleanup. This one really gets to me. Question for staff: what constitutes notification? Or is that a case law thing that hasn't been determined yet?
No, I think we can look at the practice of some of our neighboring communities who do these address encampments with notifications. It is literally like brochures and pin notification signs, like the signs that you'd see outside a liquor store for a hearing, like the really big ones.
Yeah.
As much notification as possible, outreach, direct contact with individuals. So I think communities, when they're looking at doing a cleanup, try to cover all bases in doing notification in every way they can, so they can say, we have tried everything.
Okay, so I will leave it to staff to come up with notification of a policy to propose, a notification policy that you think makes sense based on common best practices with regards to who/how is an encampment determined to be a public health hazard. Again, I'd like staff to come back to us with specific policy recommendations based on BMPs in other communities. But clearly there are public health hazards and public safety considerations, et cetera, et cetera. The one that I don't see on here that really as a dog person got to me was the whole discussion about pets. And I'd like to see what communities have dealt with that and how we can look at that, because certainly a pet is more than a pet these days, right? And for these folks, a pet is a companion. I'm sitting here, just so y'all know, I'm making a pillowcase as I embroider, because my kinetic thinking for my daughter that's got all the dogs on it. So that's how bought in we are to pets, is I'm struggling to figure out how to embroider a dog on a pillowcase. Storage, release, and disposal of property. That's another tough one, and I certainly acknowledge the biohazards. Are there companies we can contract with that will store for a fee? And the other question along those same lines I'd like to know is, are there companies or the refuge, somebody like that we can contract with to provide our own local, and I realize this is a discussion for later on, our own local shelters. And I'd like to know more about that. Specifically, I'd like to know if SCL Health has any plans for what sure looks to be a vacant little hospital there on 104th. It's actually in Westminster, but the one down by the promenade. What's going on with that building? Vacant buildings just bug the heck out of me. So the last one I want to talk about, I think relocation/survival options are, I think that's a potentially a larger discussion for the next study session, but I do want to talk about residents' expectation and communication, because residents, wait, let me back up one step. If someone is homeless, the opposite situation, the mathematical complement, if you will, I can't think of a better term than home. I'm a home individual. And those who are home, those who have homes in Broomfield, came here or grew up here with a faith, a certain confidence in a social contract with the city. And part of the social contract was that certain things would be dealt with by the police or by social services or by public works. Let's face it, you turn on the tap and you get water, it comes out. And we have this expectation of a social contract. It's more than a social contract, actually. It's a municipal contract, an enforceable contract. But there is this social contract, and I feel, I haven't quite pulled this out of my head, but I feel like somehow when someone who I refer to as homeless, if and when, as Commander Weidapur said, if it's a choice, that has that person, this is a philosophical question for my colleagues, has that person then opted out of the social contract to be more than a consumer of public services? And I would like to, as we talk about the next study session, I would like to discuss ways to re-engage people in that social contract to be more than a consumer of services. Because that does, without getting too preachy, the Bible talks about it's our responsibility. Everyone has work to do. It's our responsibility to do work. There are tasks that we're set here to do. And if those aren't getting done by choice, I'd like to figure out how we can potentially reestablish at least a nominal part of that social contract. I don't know if this is resonating with anybody or not, but I guess I really want to make sure that in the social contract, the part of the equation, we're spending a lot of time, as we should, talking about the homeless. I don't want to forget the rest of Broomfield, the home, and that social contract that we do have with everyone. So I'll ask staff then my last question. Is there anything that I didn't hit in your list? Are there any questions you have for us, for me, that I didn't hit? No, after council comments though. Madam Mayor, if I could just add a couple of things. Would you like me to do that now?
Yes, please.
I'd like to ask Clay Shuck. So, Councilmember Law Evans, part of your conversation about the consolidated approach or the multi-pronged approach from a department perspective. So we have that structure in place. Clay, walk through a little bit who's comprised on that chart team. What have we been doing so far, and the next steps? And before Clay does that, just quickly, Mayor Pro Tem Castriata and I actually had a mayor. Oh my gosh, I'm still working on that. We were at Adams County a week ago for a criminal justice session. They just completed their new animal shelter. And part of that conversation was surrounding homeless and being able to, back to the regional approach, there's a multitude of opportunities out there. All of them cost money. So part of the policy conversation that we'll have, and we'll kind of go through this after Clay goes through the chart team, it's about resources and identifying what those resources are. But going back to Councilmember Law Evans' point, the direction with regards to enforcement, we're going to have a special meeting, it sounds like, because we have to come back with these policy decisions. We can't wait until September to have these additional conversations about specifically and technically what the level of engagement looks like from a policy perspective. Clay, walk us through a little bit about the chart team, please.
Thank you. Good evening, Madam Mayor, council members. Clay Shuck, Director of Parks, Recreation, and Senior Services. One of the other cool aspects of my job is I'm the pillar lead for the social infrastructure team. And for quite a while, we've been talking about the subject. This probably goes back several months to late February, early March, when we were really starting to dive into it. And at that time, we were really kind of muddling our way through, because this was something fairly new for all of us to start talking about and start to really dive into from that work perspective and from the different perspectives of everybody that was dealing with it. And when you think about that from all the departments, and you see representation of a lot of those departments tonight, we really came down to think about it from 3 specific aspects. And that's really policy and then resources and response. And so that's kind of how we've been working through it. Not saying it's the best way to work through it, but that's right now the way we felt like it worked for us to look at from that multi-pronged approach. Obviously, policy is really with PD and with our city attorney's office and get information from them. Resources from human services and public health. And then that response, which Jen is talking about, is really more of that. When do we go in and how do we go in and help PD if we do have something that does occur or an encampment? So with that team, Kristen Pritz from Open Space, the director for Open Space, is actually running that team. And with that team, one of the things that we're talking about is bringing all those groups together when we go out. And we finally got to the place where we need to go out and look at a camp. Who's going to do that? And that chart team really is a city county-wide team. So it has representatives from PD on it, from Parks and Recreation, from Open Space, from Public Health. Kristen, if you want to help me out, who am I forgetting that's on our chart team? Human Services.
Yep.
So that's kind of a diverse group that would go out and look at a campsite and say, okay, what is our next step? And then make a determination from that point of, do we move towards a contractor? Do we keep it in-house? What's the best way to, and the safest way for staff to move forward with cleaning a camp up? I think from that perspective, you're getting a lot of subject matter experts there. At the same time, to have a real robust discussion about what's going on with this individual, how can we help them? And or if it's a vacated camp, what's the best method to take from the health and safety perspective of getting that camp cleaned up? And I think just bringing everybody together and having that opportunity to have those discussions, and we've only done it once, so it's very much in its infancy, and we do see it continue to progress and maybe even change as we work and find more best practices out there. But at least initially, that's kind of the approach that we're taking as we're looking at this overall from the perspective of individuals experiencing homelessness. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions or City Manager Hoffman, if you have anything else you would like to add to that.
No, thanks, Clay. I sure appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Shuck. Right, I think to be judicious with the time that we have tonight to focus on the direction of the approach for enforcement. We have to have guidance for our PD and our staff. So try to keep your comments on the policy itself. I know we will have part 2 and we have a lot more to talk about, but to make the best use of this time, I would ask that council members stick to the enforcement for tonight. And next we have Councilmember Lim.
Okay, thank you. Some of these are for PD and so we'll go back there. I guess a lot of my questions were already asked, so I think I'm going to go in a little different direction. So with these questions, the residents who call to report the homeless, and some of whom have been, who have been writing us, are not just concerned with the visual image, but they're concerned with safety of themselves or their children. Could you, Chief, you said the police have had, good relationships with the chronic homeless in the area. Could you characterize your perception, the police's perception of that threat that residents may perceive to their, persons, their family?
Well, it's a little bit individualized, quite honestly. And somewhat comes down to perception. So some people are in this chronic house because of addiction issues. And, some people might see that as being a danger, right? Because might be needles around, or there could be drugs around, or there could be, it's not immediate, but there could be, some people would argue that. One of the things is, as quite honestly, we see sex offenders that are already unhoused. They can't find a place to live. They'll register with us, just like they'd be registered to a house, but they'll be in this group because they will be unable to find housing because of their status as a sex offender. We'll know who they are, where they're at, that kind of stuff. Generally, we keep tabs on it to try and keep them down from being, or keep it from being a hazard to the community. Sometimes we see them on petty crimes. They're trying to feed themselves. They're trying to get what they need. So we'll catch them on petty shoplifts and that kind of stuff. So, you can run the gamut, quite honestly. So to simply say that somebody that's unhoused is a dangerous person is a little bit of a leap. But certainly they're not living up to their social contract and choosing, or at least they're living in, I'm not going to choose, but they're living in a situation that they are not getting out of, even with the chronic. And again, not the episodic and all those other ones, which are the much larger group, and we are really good at helping those, which will go over. But on this chronic, they've been in and out of addiction services. They've been in and out of different social services. They know what they can get and they know how to survive. But they're not making that transition back to that social contract, if you will. And that and quite honestly, when you're walking through the park, they're unbathed and outdoor cats and that kind of stuff. It gives people that unsafe. And quite honestly, I always tell people that the actual crime is rarely what people are afraid of. What they're afraid of is the perception of crime. And that's what I think we try to work on a lot with the police department. Obviously we're addressing the actual crime, but it's the perception of safety and the crime is what we really get out there and talk to people about, because you are very safe in Brookfield. We don't have a lot of crime in Brookfield. We work very hard to ensure we don't have a lot of crime in Brookfield. But we will see them from time to time, and they will be involved in some things.
There's been an increase in property crime in Broomfield, especially during the pandemic. So I know I have heard people try to correlate the increase in property crime with the homeless. Could you address that?
I don't think so. I think what we see when we track it is auto theft, car break-ins, sometimes burglaries. We still see, and I think we've talked about this many years in the past, that about 70% of the people that commit crime in Broomfield have no ties to Broomfield. We have good stuff. We don't tend to lock it up. So we harp on that all the time. I suppose, they're not out committing, they're not walking crime rates by any stretch of the imagination. They're not the people who are arresting, they're not the people who are putting there, they're not the people that are in felonies. What we tend to see are these low-level summonses, that kind of stuff with shoplifts. And I think I'll actually ask Commander Wiederquist, because again, he deals with them more directly than I deal with the officers. He has a comment about that.
One of the things I wanted to address real quick was some concerns that I've heard from some of our community members with regards to some of our homeless, particularly near Commons Park and near walking trails. The big concern we hear is people who are using restroom facilities. Obviously, there isn't anything provided to them, but they are, there's not a lot of cover, not a lot of effort sometimes on the part of these folks to conceal that process. That for us is a bit of a concern. When you've got, homeless near schools and near residences and near parks, where they're actually using restroom facilities. And that's been, I think of concerns I've heard outside of just visually having to look at them, having to subject or having without a real preventative warning. If you're walking with your children and suddenly you see somebody using restroom facilities out in the open. And then we get into concerns about, are these people who are registered sex offenders, and should we be concerned about this? And is it indecent exposure if they're standing there, and can't you ticket them for that? And we certainly can, but it doesn't necessarily solve that problem again specifically. Still keeps them there in that campsite. So, and again, the last question I missed, I'm happy to answer what I can, but it's going to be more about this crime rate. Yeah, we're not seeing that correlation. The officers, with the relationships that they have with these folks, I think that kind of keeps them true, right? If they know that the police know who they are, and we're sort of monitoring, keeping track of them, sometimes for their protection. We're not in the business of being Big Brother, but we certainly afford protection to everybody in the city. And when we've got people sleeping out under the stars, we owe them that same obligation. Those folks aren't necessarily inclined to, or sometimes they don't have the energy, quite frankly, to commit crime. They're surviving as best they can. And they genuinely unhoused are struggling to eat, they're struggling to feed themselves and clothe themselves. And quite frankly, I mean, panhandling would be the most logical solution to remedying that versus kicking a door in on a business or a house. It's awfully aggressive to do that when you're not necessarily predisposed to being a criminal. You're just living without a house. So.
And one further question, how do you see enforcement of this camping ban as different from enforcement of loitering? In the legal presentation, I think they defined loitering as in our municipal code. So obviously people have possessions and they're overnight. But is there a difference in your approach to the individual? How do you see the difference?
Just sort of thinking off the top of my head, I would say we wouldn't necessarily associate it with loitering because typically these are on public lands or parks, and people can go into those areas between certain hours of the day. It's the after hours then that we begin looking at violations of those municipal ordinances. But again, we're not making arrests, so we won't be taking people to jail for that. So it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. Whether we write them a ticket for camping prohibited or we write them a ticket for loitering, the fact of the matter is if we're not physically picking them up and moving them on, which we don't want to do, then we're leaving them there with a ticket and a summons that hasn't really addressed the issue.
I think Councilmember Lim, and I'll ask Nancy if she wants to weigh in this, but in my experience, anytime you use a law, whether it's loitering, camping, vagrancy, any of these, when it's as applied to the homeless is where you're going to run against a constitutional foul, if you will, of the law. And so it really doesn't, it's not limited to the specific law, it's the application of the law. And especially when it's used specifically as a way to on the homeless. So the same thing's kind of applied.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Councilmember Lim, did you want to provide any feedback or guidance on enforcement before we move on? Not that's fine.
Did you just ask for Councilmember Groom?
No, I said Councilmember Lim. I asked if she
Oh,
wanted to provide.
sorry.
That's okay. So if not, then we'll move on to Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. So I will try to skip over ones that are not relevant for today, but the majority of the questions that I have here come directly from a meeting that I had with a group of mostly Ward 4 constituents. And the first one is, in our code, section 1228-280, which states certain conduct prohibited within any park, it is unlawful for any person to do any of the following acts. A, to camp or lodge in any park without first having obtained a permit therefore from the Director of Parks and Recreation. And the question is, why does it refer to this permit? Because is there any permit that can even be obtained? That was one of the questions that the residents had is, should that language be removed? Thank you, Clay.
Good evening again. Thank you for that question. So from my understanding, the intent of that is if we had a group of people who wanted to do an overnight camp, Boy Scout group, Decker group, something like that, that we had some provision in there that we could permit them to rent or reserve a space, just like we would for a field rental or anything else on a temporary basis.
Okay, thank you. And maybe in our thoughts going forward with any regulations or ordinances, we could clarify the intent of that to, I think there was a concern that there could become a process by which homeless individuals could go and obtain a permit then. That was, I believe, the concern. And then as we're going forward with regulations or ordinances, can we be more specific in those about locations that are off limits, like entire sections of open space that are more central to Broomfield and more visible, or that are closer to homes, or keep a setback from residences, or a certain setback from schools, or something similar? Can we be very specific and keep certain places off limits while allowing it in other places that are more remote? Probably kind of just going along the lines of what you're already enforcing, maybe.
Well, I think that's kind of the crux of the policy decision for tonight, because certainly the code says you can't do it, right? In parks, open space, that kind of stuff, but then it opens it up to right of ways, medians, underpasses, and that kind of stuff. Again, it's that. But then when you get to the point where there's no place to go, and we have no option to give them, and then we enforce, then we go back to what Nancy and Christina were talking about on those 4 feet and 14th Amendment violations, just because of how it is. So the answer is yes, but I guess.
And I guess the next following question on that would it be helpful to our Broomfield Police Department to have certain areas that are, and I'm not suggesting, so I'm just curious to start to define for those areas where it's simply not allowed or would be allowed, would that be beneficial, or is it? I'm not sure how to make that decision.
I'm gonna take a shot at that, Councilmember Anderson. I think from the PD's perspective, from open space perspective, when we're discussing an ordinance, which more of this conversation occurs in September. But that said, the more caveats, the more opportunity that we will need to enforce. And so if you have homeless in one area that they are precluded by ordinance to be in right now, and then we think that the unintended consequences of then segregating out areas that you can and can't, then you have the homeless person that then moves into the area that you can, after having been engaged with the PD perhaps the day before. So really from a policy direction perspective, keeping it as clean as we can. Back to the kind of those bullet points on what the cadence of engagement, the rules of engagement for PD essentially is, again, to remind council, particularly with Boulder Sweep that's coming, we are going to be seeing more soon. So the tools with which the cadence and priority of summons only, limited enforcement, really clarifying what those definitions are, and to Gary's point, if not here, where? So again, and that dictates what that rule of engagement is. So again, that's the first part of the conversation, right? This is a really difficult conversation to have. Nonetheless, from a policy perspective, we have to have some directions on what the rules of engagement are for our PD.
Okay, thank you. So then I'll kind of jump down to a different question I had, which was there was actually, maybe I should go in this order. So one of the kind of general consensuses that I heard from talking to so many residents was those who have strong ties to Broomfield, there is a more of an affinity to want to and a desire to try to help them. it's kind of that balancing of how much of our, how much can we spend on these resources? Because I'm hearing from a lot of residents, they don't want their taxes to go up, to increase taxes to try to cover these additional resources. They want to help those who are already here, but now it sounds like it's not that simple, because then you can't deny that to another individual. So, and this is a question, I don't have a solution to it. So if, is there any way that we can help those who are already here, versus, we don't want to be a magnet to attract more individuals. I know you're saying that there's new sweeps and they will be coming, and the question for the residents is, why should that become our burden? It's going to be the burden of so many different communities, and it's like we want to just help those who are here. But it sounds like that's going to be problematic. And if we can provide convenient shelter that meets the people who are unhoused where they are, allowing the pets, allowing the unmarried couples, allowing so many, to try to find exactly what they want that meets their needs, they're just going to become a magnet. And we're kind of back, as we fill that section up, we're back at square one. And so I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that they'd like to share, but that is a concern that's kind of out there, is that yes, people want to help, and there is this humanity piece to it, but we are just going to continue the concern is we're going to continue to attract more individuals here, and that is not what we want to do.
Well, I think Councilmember Anderson, to your point, right, it's cyclical. So by doing bullet 1 and 2, you will, by design or by happenstance, create bullet number 3. So for the communities that do the sweeps, I'm not necessarily, calling out Denver and or Boulder. Boulder has a really comprehensive approach. So when you say sweep, it's different there. I mean, they have a whole host of things. And back to Councilmember Law Evans' point and Councilmember Tessier's point, some of the services that we have available in Broomfield, like I think it was Councilmember Tessier, the Bridge the Gap program. So it is the one step away from losing your car, losing your transportation, which leads to losing your housing. That said, some of the criteria that we have attached to that is you have to be sustainable afterwards. So again, some of the criteria for the programs that we have right now, but becoming a magnet, people are going to go where they don't get kicked out. So that's whether you have a shelter or whether you have any kind of policy that allows, a compassionate approach is going to draw people here. So we can't differentiate compassion for what is in our heart versus what's in our checkbook. And when we're talking about residency, as Chief Krieger had pointed out, the majority of chronic homeless folks don't have ID. And so there's just no way to be able to categorize residents or non-residents. Again, Abby's keeping copious notes. We're debriefing tomorrow night on the tangible specifics, what it costs, where the land is. Again, but we're never going to get away from anything that we do from a resource perspective. It's going to, from a Grapevine perspective, some of our surrounding communities, their level of acceptance is very, very low. I don't know any other way to put it. So from a Grapevine perspective, the bigger the heart, the more the folks. And that's, and that will be with any, that will be with any project or programs or program that we have from a service delivery model.
Okay, so I have a follow-up question to that one then. If we were to designate an area, and not necessarily suggesting that, but we were to designate this area, because I just don't know where that area would be, because everybody's going to have that. It's like, not in my backyard, but put it over there. We're going to hear a lot of that. So if there was this place and we could house so many, allow camping, anytime camping, whatever is on that location, could we put a restriction on the amount of time that an individual could camp there before we need that spot opened up again? Like you have weeks or months or however long, and then we're going to have you figure something out. This is the amount of time to do this because we are going to need to allow people to use it. Is that a legal question, I think, for Nancy, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, Nancy can weigh in on, it, but it's also administration piece,
Right.
right? So then you have to follow up with each one, the application, the date, the services. You all can, I mean, your city council, you can direct staff to have whatever that methodology of qualification, if you will, to get in and to turn over. Nancy.
I think we see similar requirements in the provision of other public services. So I think it's totally lawful to do that. It's just going to be, as with all of these things, as applied to that specific situation.
Okay, thank you, because I think there's a overarching piece there that continually comes back to that what cost do our residents have to bear, as this time goes forward? Do you want these? There's a much greater desire to help those who are going to get back on their feet, like Councilman Tessier was talking about catching them before they fall. There's so much more so much more support in that area. And then my final question has to do with the safety concerns. And there was an email that was sent in to all of council, I believe, about disposing of bodily waste in storm drains, and also along with the hypodermic needles and other human waste. And when there are not facilities nearby and we start to see that, I would assume that would qualify as a safety concern that should be addressed if there are individuals disposing directly into the sewer system. And so is that something that, and we're trying, I'm assuming that in this discussion, we're trying to just get away from all of this where we are having these situations by getting to a place where there are facilities. I know you're looking for us for direction, but I'm looking back to you.
No. I mean, again, Mayor and council, we anticipated all of these questions. That's not to say that we anticipate them to the extent of having answers for them. I wish we did, but we don't. Having a facility is unequivocally a short-term, long-term answer for a lot of the urgent and emerging issues that we have. Unfortunately, that's a follow-up conversation that then requires the funding and resources, whereas the answers that we need with regards to current enforcement is really what's on that's really what we need right now.
So for that's all of my questions. And so regarding the enforcement, I really do want to see, I know constituents in Ward 4, there's a heavy desire to, especially in the commons area and open space surrounding there, is to not allow camping in those areas. And I don't know where those places are where we wouldn't want to enforce it, but whatever. I guess the direction I want to provide, and it's not perfect, is that whatever we have, I want to enforce it. And so I want to make sure, and I don't think we're going to quite get there tonight, and I agree on that, but I want to make sure that we put something very straightforward together that is enforceable. And I'll listen to what other councilors have to say, but
And
thank you.
that might help Councilmember Anderson, we won't enforce here, but that seems like we're running on an equal protection issue here really closely too, and maybe Nancy wanted to explain that. That seems very difficult to do that.
I think it's problematic on a few levels. Actually, legally, and I'll give council an opinion offline, it might be okay. There's certain places where we allow certain behaviors, certain places where we don't allow certain behaviors across the city. But that's very complicated from an enforcement point of view for our staff and for our residents and for our individuals who are unhoused, who are trying to make sure they do it right. So I just think that might be a challenging situation.
I think rather than thinking of this as where they can't, I think, in my opinion, it's where they can. That's the place where they can. And when you have that, then all other places you can't, right? So kind of to the case law here, you can camp here, you can go here, you can go to shelter here. Therefore, you are not allowed to go to these other places. Is the better approach rather than doing these, trying to piecemeal it. I think that's going to get very complicated very quickly and be more problematic.
Thank you, I appreciate that, and I think that would be where I'm leaning, that is to find that place where they can camp with the resources so that we're not having bodily waste on the ground and other situations and go from there, but I don't know if that's, I don't know where that place is, so I'll leave it at that, thank you.
All right, thank you. We are past our 8 p.m. break time, so it's 8:11. We're going to take a 10-minute break and resume council member questions and comments at 8:21. We'll see you in 10 minutes. Council member.
Okay, thanks.
ahead and get started. Councilmember Groom, are you still on the line?
I am. Thank you very much.
All right, you are up next. So you have the floor. Go ahead.
All right. I was just watching everybody retake their seats there, but I guess I do want to address some of the comments associated with enforcement. And I think we're at a phase where over-analysis could be our paralysis in making sure that we get direction to our police enforcement tonight or extremely soon. So I think we should take this in phases. At least that would be my recommendation. And that is, what do we need to do in the immediate term? And I've kind of outlined a few things. One is added high to the list is we need a contract for homeless beds. And I know that that could be very difficult, but I would like to see what our options are. As we've been sitting here, I've been looking online at what are the possibilities of getting, 10 to 15 beds dedicated to Broomfield. I think we need to do that immediately. I do think a lot of our surrounding communities do have a homeless hotline. So I think that's something that we could set up fairly immediately, but I would like staff feedback on how long it would take to get a homeless hotline set up. And then another thing to define is the health and safety and what is the safety of a site. And that's what I had heard me to determine. And those things I think we can do fairly quickly. In addition, I would like to have a conversation about modifying our code language and establishing changes to include open space and not just parks and open space for encampments. And then when it comes to police enforcement for right now, what I think I heard in regards to maybe it was the Barton case. I'm sorry if I've messed that up. Oh, no, sorry. It was the Homeless Out Loud versus Denver, where that established at least a baseline for Denver to give the 7-day summons notice and then another notice 2 days for removal. I think that would be very fair to start immediately. We've already got that code in place. And we can put the summons notifications and the notice of removal. And then I realized that there is an issue with removing. I can tell you that I've talked to some surrounding communities, and Thornton actually has a facility that they've converted for storage of homeless encampment removal. And I think Broomfield could be somewhat unique like Thornton has and establish that site. They have a 30-day, they don't come and get their stuff in 30 days. They actually remove the property from their storage. I'm not sure if 30 days is appropriate. So I think those are some phase immediate steps. I would like us to start enforcing our code, but I don't think we should start doing that until we have the contract, or at least an offer. With 80% of them having either, I believe 80%, I want to get my facts straight here. 60%, I'm sorry, is struggling with mental health and 80% with some kind of addiction. I do think that not having out and in the public is safety, not only themselves, but also for the residents of Broomfield. And then in phase 2, the more short term. So again, I'm not talking year, talking long term. Phase 2, which would be a short term. I think we need a task force, but not necessarily made up of our community members, but a regional task force. So what I've seen in all of my readings and studying is Denver does a sweep, Boulder does a sweep, Dallas does a sweep, or whatever, and we're shuffling people around, and I don't think it's fair to them, nor is it fair to the community members at large. So I do think developing a North or some kind of regional task force, because it is a shell game, and it is whichever community is creating the magnet is what they'll come to. So as a region, and even working with Denver or Boulder, or both have a set plan, and we have very similar guidance, and they understand what boundaries they're going to experience, not because they're in Broomfield or Boone County or Adams County, but because we're all regionally wanting to consider this problem. And then in phase 2, we do need to look at what is our long-term homeless shelter solution, and really consider what we as Broomfield County and city and county want to do there. And then any additional code changes. So I think the short term needs to be even pulled out of this to say, what are the things we can handle in the next few months versus the immediate, how do we give direction to our police force and code enforcement and our staff that is immediate. So those are some of the things that I want to be able to look at. What is immediate, what is short term? I want establishing a task force or a regional task force to hold up immediate actions that we should be given right now. So again, I'm just going to say include some kind of contract for a number of homeless beds, 10, 15 homeless hotline, define what health and safety of a site is, establish a team, code enforcement team that we just talk with them, give them a notice, and then the notice. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Your audio was a little broken up, so it might be good if you could maybe type that in something, write it down and send it to us, because I didn't catch some of it. I apologize. It was coming in and out. Yeah, about the last 30 seconds. Okay.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you.
Certainly.
Councilmember Lindstedt.
I'm sorry, did you say I had 30 seconds?
No,
I
the
didn't catch
last,
that.
your time was up, but the last 30 seconds that when you were speaking was a bit choppy, the audio. So if you can type that, we're gonna move on.
Okay.
Tired, but if you write it down and send it.
Oh, because I didn't realize other council members. I'm sorry. Overview. I didn't realize, based on the other council members' times, I didn't realize we were on a time tonight.
We always are on a time. Yeah.
So I would request all the other council members be held to the time also.
And
there were definitely council members that exceeded the time.
Did you want to wrap up?
Thank you. I take the time.
I didn't get that. Okay, the time was expired. Councilmember Lindstedt.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you for the comprehensive presentation tonight. We came into the meeting tonight with my mind not made up, and now it's even more kind of in the middle of this slide. So there's a lot to think about, and they're really human and difficult issues to deal with. I guess I'll start by saying I'm kind of in the middle here. and then I'll give you some context as to why. And I'll try to keep myself as limited as I can to the questions on the slide. I think I would need to learn more from legal and maybe in an executive session what the ramifications of strict enforcement mean in regards to Martin v. City of Boise and People v. Burton. I think those are the two that I pulled out, and what that threshold means for us. The problem we have here is that Denver and Boulder don't have enough beds, and they offer services and they're overwhelmed, and we haven't been doing our part for a long time in terms of paying for those services that we rely on regionally. And now we're seeing the side effects of those long-term decisions. I guess one question I have is, there's sweeps happening in these two neighboring communities. We have the eviction moratorium set to expire at the end of July. As the Supreme Court ruled today. I kind of wonder why this is suddenly such an emergency, and those are good reasons, but we've had this issue a long time. There have been people going to Fort Collins to find beds for a long time, and we've never really taken a proactive approach to address it. And now we're experiencing that shortcoming, and I guess I have a little bit of a bone to pick with. I know it's well intended, but the approach of keeping it not publicly visible all these years probably wasn't the right thing to do, because it never got here into this council where we're discussing it and discussing resource allocation and these other problems. And it's a tricky situation for us to be in now, where we've done such a woefully poor job of allocating those resources for so long, and now it's an emergency. And I wish this had been brought up sooner, and I wish, now we're talking about special meetings. For initially, we should have had a game plan on, a decade ago. So, I'm disappointed. Now clearly we do have a problem now. We have a public health problem. You can't have people using, storm drains and things for hygiene, and we need to come to a solution that's constitutional and respects people's constitutional rights and is empathetic. So I do support some type of enforcement that's legally allowed, and we need a place for people to go, at least temporarily, and we need to adequately fund regional services because we're in a pinch, and under no circumstance do I want us removing the possessions of someone who is struggling with finding housing without them having a very wide number of opportunities to get them back. I don't want our officers in that position, and I don't want our city in the legal liability, and ethically, I don't want to be a city taking away people's possessions. That makes me very, very uncomfortable. It's tricky. When we're talking about issues of addiction, and people who are struggling with addiction, I would like to think about that in a little bit different way. If you want someone to get clean and get a job and really, the bootstraps, whatever position that is, the social contract that Councilmember Law Adams was bringing up, you got to have people be housed to get clean. If you're trying to get clean and you're unhoused, that would be an impossible task to accomplish, and it's already very, very hard to do. So I really struggle with that and what to do with the people who are struggling with addiction in our community. I know it's not all, people who are experiencing homelessness, but there are some, and we need to figure out some better comprehensive approach that will actually lead to people getting sober in a people-focused way. I talked about that last time when we were talking about mental health issues, Yeah, I guess I'll leave it with that. I don't want Broomfield to end up on another city council slide deck when they're addressing this issue like the city of Boise. I don't want Broomfield on that slide, and I don't support enforcement that would put us anywhere near that legal risk. But I don't know, my thoughts are all over. It's a really tough subject, and I just really sincerely appreciate the thoughtfulness, and I think we need a lot more conversations, and it's about time that we have these conversations. So I'll end there. Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, staff.
Thank you, Councilmember Shack.
Thank you, Mayor. So I think that, what's missing from this conversation for me is data, is to really fully understand what this is. In October of 2018, I attended my self-appointment or council appointment to the Boulder Consortium of Cities, where we had a conversation about homelessness. So this was back in October 2018. There we were presented with data for Boulder County, how many individuals were experiencing homelessness, what these demographics were of those individuals. So does Broomfield have that data to kind of shed light on what our current issue is?
We do not. One of the reasons, Councilmember Schaaf, that Boulder County, and we've had numerous conversations, not just with the county, but with the city, is because they have a shelter. So again, it's for Broomfield, our point of reference is the annual homeless survey, which we all acknowledge and know is tremendously flawed. It's a point in time survey. In fact, that's the name of it. So depending upon where you are during the 6 hours of collection, the rest of it is anecdotal. And so we've had a lot of conversations with the chart team, particularly the first point of contact, which is PD. I would like to say that even if we put forth more effort, we'd be able to get you that data. But from all the conversations that we've had, we're not going to. Again, it's a transient, it's a mobile, the stop and check in. I think from a quantitative perspective, I don't know if it's qualitative because it's not scientific data, but Chief Krieger has mentioned before, probably 90% of the people they come in contact with, they've come in contact with numerous times. They know them on a first name basis. But as far as that data collection, Chief, you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, and maybe this will help with a little bit of reference. Again, we're talking about the chronically homeless, right? It is probably, it's a very small number. All the other things under there are the groups that we see more often. It's what Fish sees, it's what our partners see, and they have a lot of resources. That's the ones you're putting on that transition trail back to, getting them permanently housed, getting them back in the workforce, getting those kinds of things. This is a pretty small group, and yet they're very visible. So is that number increasing? I'd say the answer is yes, just simply anecdotally, just by the complaints you're seeing. But we're not talking hundreds of people in Broomfield. We're talking probably a pretty small number, and I don't know if Dan Casey can put any quantity behind that. It's just they're so visible, they're the ones you're hearing about. There's a lot more people that we're really helping to get through that episodic or that transitional and all those other ones. This is the group that's really hard because they're not wanting to. They use what services they need at the time, but they're not really looking to get out of that situation necessarily. So that's where that enforcement comes a point of, if you won't, then you can't. And then you get the legal issue. So it's I think a relatively small number. It's just very visible.
Mr. Casey, can you share some of the data as limited as it is with council, please?
Sure, thank you. Good evening. Dan Casey, Director of Human Services. Manager Hoffman is exactly right. We don't have a centralized collection point. We are starting to get some of that data now. Built for Zero was mentioned earlier. We'll actually have names associated with who our homeless are in Broomfield. We get into the notion of
that connection to Broomfield. Did they go to school here? Do they work here? Do they have family here or not? Or are they passing through? So it's really hard to put a pinpoint number on that unless we had somewhere where we could say, yes, our shelter shows that 350 people came through this year. The limited data that I do have, some of it is a little bit dated. For instance, in 2018, McKinney-Vento, which is a program run through school districts, the Department of Education, which tracks students that are reporting being unhoused. McKinney-Vento numbers showed in Boulder Valley School District for Broomfield, we had 37 students. You multiply that by 2.5 or so because parents and siblings and that type of thing. So right there, you're at about 60-ish, and that's just McKinney-Vento. As Jen mentioned, our point in time study in 2019 reflected 27 unhoused individuals in the city and county of Broomfield. We know that that number is not even remotely close, unless we're only talking about the chronic and the folks that we caught during that 6 or 8 or 10 hour window of time. 2020 numbers for our hotel vouchers, we issued out 40 hotel vouchers for 40 households. Fish reported in 2020 about 145 unduplicated unhoused individuals in Broomfield. And if you think about the iceberg there, that's probably all categories. It's not one or the other. And then the last data that I have is Clinica. And Clinica provides services to our Medicaid population and also for unhoused. And they reported Broomfield having, in 2020, Broomfield having 62 unduplicated unhoused residents. So it's really hard to put a number exactly. We anecdotally, we talk about roughly 200. There's folks that are, again, that invisible couch surfing, sleeping in their car, moving from city to city or Walmart to Walmart that we just don't know about. So if we were guessing, the number that we often use is about 200. So, and that's, again, all categories on that iceberg.
Well, thank you for that. I think that, I mean, so some of those are raw numbers, the 200, roughly 200 unhoused individuals, the 60 individuals that Clinica showed, some of those are those raw numbers. But if we were to use, could we use some of those percentages that Boulder County is showing, which is, and I'm just flipping to it right now, showing that many of the individuals that were counted in Boulder County, 41% have been with the county for 2 years longer. 25% report having family in the county. So on one data collection point is how many of these individuals that are experiencing homelessness here in Broomfield are connected to our community. And that data point for me is very important because what that shows is that this isn't just somebody else's problem that they shifted to Broomfield. This is Broomfield's problem that we either shifted to another county and it's come back, or this is a problem that's being created in our own county. We know part of the reason that that problem is being created is because of our affordable housing crisis that we have. We do not have enough affordable housing, thus our homeless population is getting bigger. So I think that, those in order to truly solve this problem, we've got to collect more data, we've got to collect better data. And I think that to go along with that, one of the big things for me is, what is the cost of inaction, of doing nothing versus the cost of actually trying to solve this problem. And I think that we've got to have those numbers and Mr. Casey talked about some of those, the hotel vouchers, are one piece of that, just for instance, Boulder County shared with me that 9 clients housed using the city of Boulder permanent supportive housing vouchers stayed 4,100 nights at the Boulder shelter, 1,250 jail bed nights, and averaged 20 ambulance trips to the emergency room every year. And they lived on the streets cumulative for 100 years. 9 individuals. So, here we have, possibly, I'm not quite sure what our chronic number would be out of those 200, but if we said that, 10 of those were that's quite the cost. So I think that, some of the things that we've heard tonight is there's the long-term solutions, and of course, we have the short-term solutions. The long-term solutions are many of those things that we have been working towards, which is housing first. solutions, looking at affordable housing, permanent supportive housing. Those are going to be the pieces with that. We have that there's the affordable housing, and part of that that's not affordable is because of wages. Wages have grown by 9%, but the home values have grown 60 to 70%. So those two things are out of sync. Construction costs continue to rise as well. There's a lack of housing stock. So many of these things are contributing to this problem. Some of these in which we're solving, and some of these others that we haven't necessarily worked on. So the short term, and I guess this is where I have the question is right now before us we have the camping ban. So the idea is, if not there, where? And for me, I don't have that answer. I don't have the answer of where. But there has to be a there. There has to be a there, because right now we do not have a good solution. So to just tell these individuals, you can't stay here, where are they to go? And that for me is hard. So I think the first thing that we have to do is to find that there. And I think that we have options, and then and especially some short term, we've got to find that short term option, because we can't construct a shelter overnight. And looking at permanent supportive housing, that's something that we've been working on long term already, and we can't necessarily set that up overnight. But we've got to come up with a short term where for these individuals, because it's not right of our regional partners to be breaking up these camps and dispersing these individuals. We can't do that as well. So we've got to find a where. And I think that that may mean a 6-month tent site or something of that nature until we can start to really dive into those long-term solutions. This is a regional issue, and we've got to set up some type of regional task force with our other municipalities to solve this problem and to find some solutions very quickly. And that can only happen in a regional way. And I think that, this isn't, for us, it isn't a new conversation. Like I said, I attended the Bullock Consortium of Cities conversation back in 2018. Staff and council have had this conversation since 2018. We've talked about the Boulder shelter. We've got to move this conversation forward in a much bigger way. We can't continue to talk about whether or not residents of Broomfield want a homeless shelter and just continue to kick the problem down the road. We've got to find those solutions. So short-term solution on where these individuals are going to go, and then start getting those long-term solutions set up pretty quickly in a regional way.
Thank you. Councilmember Tessier.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Can we put that slide back up that gives us what we're looking at today? And as much as I want to answer the questions tonight, and I don't think I'm disappointed. I think I'm really grateful for this conversation. I think, it's time, and I'm glad that we have the opportunity. So a couple of things coming up for me. I'm not about strict enforcement, unless it's a public health and safety and welfare. So what does that constitute? And I'm looking at our deputy public health director, and I'm looking at, what does it mean for our soil, our water, our air to be at a point where it becomes a public health threat? So what does that look like? And those are some things that I think would determine how we move. The other thing, I believe it wouldn't take long for this. I think the city might have a map of all the land that they own. And I'm wondering if there is an opportunity to also reach out to, I can certainly reach out to Marty with the Refuge and some of my partners with the faith-based community to see if they'd be willing to be host sites, and for how long, and what would that mean. I absolutely agree. We need to get Governor and our Lieutenant Governor to do something about this issue across the region and across the state. This is not going anywhere, and I think that, I don't want my kids to be tripping over a needle. I really don't. And so how do we provide dignity and compassion at the same time as not breaking the law or being sued? So looking at the costs of the storage and the and disposal property, I believe there are other places around the region who are doing this already and looking at, and could we, for example, if it's Big Dry Creek, could we partner with Westminster on that and have it, if it's on the borders of Boulder, we partner with Boulder. And I do believe that pieces of this can be answered in this context, right? And I don't, relocation and survival, was that more like weather? What did that, I'm sorry, I forgot.
So, Councilor Tessier, if we're gonna relocate them, say, in other words, if we're gonna enforce our ban on parks, open space and that kind of stuff, we gotta give them a place to go where they have a place to relocate and a place to survive, because that's really the key.
Gotcha.
Obviously. They gotta have a place to survive.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, I think I answered that in, looking at what property, and that the city and county owns, how can we get other partners involved? I think I answered everything. Did I give you enough direction? For this moment in time, and I know this is another community conversation. It's a tough one, and I'm not saying I want these encampments to be here, right?
Absolutely. And again, so from a regional conversation and perspective, we keep talking about a regional approach. We are engaged. The police department is, HHS is, economic vitality consistently, right? I mean, these conversations really started in February. So to Councilmember Lindstedt's point, it's not one thing that's driving this, right? It's a culmination of events. And he's also absolutely correct. I mean, Director Casey and I have had this conversation for about 4 years about relying on others to provide, particularly during the winter, particularly for domestic violence victims, particularly for just a whole host of at-risk populations, not necessarily homeless, but at-risk in general.
Yes.
I don't think any community, I just got back from that, city managers conference. Half of it was all about homelessness and the solutions, short-term and long-term. They look at Broomfield and say, I wish we had your problem. Again, from a perspective of not only public health and safety, but from a financial perspective as well. The reason I say a special meeting is to bring those, again, we have the philosophical, ideological, deeper dive that a lot of us want to have on September 7th. It's sounding, if I may take liberty, that the ordinance, that the ban that we have in place right now, we're not going to enforce. We will come back to you all. So Councilmember Tessier, we, again, from Abby's notes and action items at the debrief tomorrow, we can turn around pretty quickly with the plots of land that we own, with the plots of lands that we can lease, the higher level conversation about costs. So whether it's a tent or it's a longer term solution, utilizing the ARPA monies, right? We're getting half of that imminently into the coffers. So again, there's a whole host of opportunities and options. Tonight was really designed because of the citizen feedback that we have been receiving. So that essentially, the conversation needs to be had, we're having it, but we've been having it just in different circles. Tonight is in response to those citizens. Particularly as Chief Creeder said, the visibility when you have a camp or it's not even a camp, right? It's a tent that pops up in the commons. And then it's back to Commander Kirk's point about, it's not that something bad has happened, it's the anticipation of something new occurring in commons, that something's going to happen. Whether it be from the tenants of that tent or the flock that is about to show up. So again, those fears become real, and then council hears about it and staff hears about it. And so again, it's not a knee-jerk reaction on the homelessness conversation. And if I'm misinterpreting from council's perspective about not enforcing that ban, if we could talk just a little bit about that. And then we will send out dates where we will come back. Councilmember Teste, to your point, there's a lot by the refuge. I don't know who owns it. I don't know if possibly it could be from a temporary into a more permanent site. But again, it facilitates the conversation about the if not here, where. And it also facilitates the conversation about what type of administrative lift that will be to manage it, not only from a public health perspective, but a public safety perspective and from a staff perspective. That's right. So we'll come back, we won't have all the answers, but we'll have short-term options and the costs that are associated with each.
Yeah, and the last thing that's coming up for me too is that, if there are programs like, Housing First and, looking at that as we're going into our housing authority conversations, those are some of the things that can also help offset the cost. And we know that right now it is much cheaper to house people than to keep them in this cycle. And if everybody's kind of doing their part in the region, then it won't really matter if they're influxing from other places. We'll all have the numbers that we can help, I guess, or assist or guide into hopefully better living situations. So I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.
Yeah, this issue knows no boundaries.
Thank you. Councilmember Henkel's next.
Thank you. I realize I've talked a lot tonight and just really appreciate this conversation. I did actually talk with Marty today and he did talk about a place. So he mentioned 116th and Teller, which is over by there. And we were even talking about like what does it look like as far as if we can give that owner of the property like some sort of tax break or whatnot too. We're not really sure, but it's definitely a conversation to have. I would like to see sort of an emergency letter sent out to our region saying, hey, we're feeling you and we are willing to step up and this is what we're going to do. And I think a big part of that is, contacting, maybe your safe outdoor spaces. And there's already programs already built. And I know that might be a huge lift as far as, that program is concerned. But if we can, say, hey, we're looking into spaces, we're looking into resources that are close to other resources like the refuge. And this is what we're going to do. And we would like to have, some regional support as well. I'm sure Boulder and Denver has been asking for this for many years. We've been shipping off our homeless to other places. So I'm curious as to how are we talking with other regions exactly, as far as like this being an emergency, because I hear it being talked a lot about, and I spoke to one of the people who happened to be at the refuge today, and she said, I'm tired of people doing study sessions about this. Let's do something. And I couldn't agree more. So how are we talking with other regions, in what spaces? And how do we elevate this, not only to a task force eventually, which I think we can develop that, we need like an emergency task force. This is not something that we can wait on. And I don't want to say, necessarily how many beds, because I do know that we, have the numbers like 60 some that are, that have been unhoused in Broomfield that are, by name. We do need to develop that list for sure. That can upload into that main list. But I think we definitely need to not only say we're going to do something, but we need some sort of like immediate emergency summit, because by the end of July, we're gonna have 6 times the amount of homeless all throughout the state of Colorado. So this has to be, I would say an emergency task force in my eyes. So, stat, tomorrow we're talking safe outdoor spaces, we're talking to Marty, we're talking, to the property owners, what can we do? Because I'm feeling, that you guys don't have a place to put them. I will say though, that my husband and I went over to the cemetery and checked out that tent that was over by, I felt like it was more towards the cemetery, and it's interesting how people see things, and other people said it's more towards the commons, and they said, it's right near the soccer fields. I felt like I could barely see it, first of all. Secondly, it was not there a long time. So there was also a perception, and I noticed in people's verbiage, our language is very important. A lot of people said, yes, that homeless person was moved. And some people would say, that homeless person moved. So there's a huge difference there between, our police did their job, they moved them, they forced them out. And I guarantee you, a lot of them went on their own will. So can we have just some sort of talk as to how these tents are actually gone, because they're gone within, usually a lot of them between 24 to 48 hours. Some of them stay a little bit longer. What does that look like? When we ask a person who has moved, what would they say about Broomfield and how they moved from their spot?
Councilor Hinkle, that's a hard question to answer, because I'm answering from somebody's else's perspective. I believe we did enforce on that one, did we not?
We asked and they moved not voluntarily.
So we've enforced, we've written 1 ticket so far in 2021 to get somebody to move out of the park property open space, and then one we asked them to move because they were so visible and we were getting so many complaints, and they voluntarily.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I think the issue is too, is I agree with Councilmember Lindstedt, is that I don't want to steal people's property. We had an issue in Denver where a lady was just begging for her daughter's ashes to be returned to her. These are people's belongings, and I don't want to see them taken from them. So I think that's it for now, but I definitely feel like there has to be some sort of emergency letter that we have each other's backs as a region, for sure. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. I have one question, and then I will go through this list here. So would it be possible, because understanding that we cannot limit the duration of stay in whatever facility or outdoor camping area that we decide on, and that the thought of we don't want to continue to have to grow it, that area to, if we don't want to become this permanent fixture where you just keep adding more and more people, could we allow a specific location and these are the facilities so that we don't have the human waste around them? Permanent camping, but require that all of those using that space must pack up their belongings during specific daytime hours and come back at a specified time to establish camp for the night. So it doesn't become this like growing, like you can't just keep accumulating more, that you would have to, it would keep it limited to what that each individual had there and how, because the longer the time, the more stuff is going to accumulate and the more the waste piles. Is that?
Sure. So Councilmember Anderson, so your creativity is helpful during this conversation, but the question is, where would they go during those hours? So there's and if I may just real quickly for Councilmember Hinkle, the folks that are addressing it are a multitude. So the fact that she's, the person from study session to study session, I'm sure she does feel that way. From an execution perspective, until she has a spot, she'll probably continue to feel that way. So again, the conversations, and I get the sense of urgency to have something concrete happen and happen quickly. It all gets back to that location piece. So even when we come back from an option perspective, hearing back from the neighbors that will be surrounding whatever place that we determine to be the most transit oriented, and really finances isn't even gonna be a part of it, right? It's gonna be access to service, transit oriented, and the capability to hold staff from a public health perspective, right? So pop-up showers, pop-up shelter, short-term, long-term. So I'm confident that we can identify some spots for council to agree upon and execute on. One of the pieces in all the conversations that we've been having is not necessarily access to the services, but access to the equipment. So there's a lot of folks out there that are scrambling right now for temporary shelters with regards to individual housing. You can't find a tent, can't find sleeping pads, can't find cots. Even the use of the outdoor toiletries and sinks and mobile, like the lavatories, if you've seen it before, when you go to a concert and there's like 6 of them, it's like the size of a railroad car. Everyone is scrambling for those pieces for their community as well. So it'll be a great problem to have when we locate a place and are struggling for the equipment pieces. But again, that's where the level of conversation is right now. So it's not just the sense of urgency in communicating that. I think, again, from a regional approach, I just got 2 text messages, one from Westy and one from Adams County, knowing that we're having that conversation tonight. It was that, the animal shelter, as well as everybody regionally is very cooperative on this particular issue. There hasn't been a conversation that Broomfield hasn't been paying its own way, so you're not welcome at the table anymore at all. I haven't experienced that at all on these conversations. Councilmember Anderson, to your question, many of the day shelters, including Boulder and Denver in particular, and several that are in Aurora, have that rule to where you need to be up and out and showered by 7, and then you can check in again for dinner at 6. But those are metropolitan areas that can then absorb or assume those folks leaving to then be mobile with wherever they're going to be in that community, only to return that evening. It's different for us here. So again, that it's that multi-pronged approach to ensure that on those 5 categories, we're able to provide and to evaluate where they are on that slide. It gets back to Councilmember Schaaf's point about really creating that data, so that then we can target the resources, whether it's beefing up the Bridge the Gap program, which we've never been at 0. We started 4 years ago with $40,000. During COVID, we increased it to Director Casey.
100,000.
And we've never been less than 40,000. So again, and then, to Chief Krieger's comment about issuing 1 ticket in 2021. So again, the multi-pronged approach, the comprehensive approach won't delay us pulling the trigger on location. It's the location that will be council's conversation that will be as important as this conversation tonight. But all those restrictions and requirements, Councilmember Anderson, Absolutely. And generally, those restrictions come with a more permanent facility and not a temporary facility.
Okay, thank you. And maybe I would just add to it that, the intent would be to be able to clean up everything and keep it from accumulating and something along those lines where you wouldn't necessarily have to completely vacate and leave, but just allow the site to all be cleaned up or something so that it doesn't become a growing, just continues to grow and grow and grow in those areas. Okay, so regarding these questions on the enforcement approach that is preferred, I felt the frustration of the constituents when there was the miscommunication, that I'm gonna call miscommunication, that we're not, the council saying, no, don't need to enforce this. We want something that we can enforce. And this is where it becomes kind of problematic because it's going to be a very well-written policy that allows the strict enforcement. But considering that this policy has to be able to be effectively implemented by our police officers. Like, we don't want to put anybody in an uncomfortable place here, so whatever that wording is. But that's where I want to be. I want something that whatever we craft, that we can actually, that we do enforce it and we actually can enforce it. So obviously, listening to help of our police department will be critical because it has to be something that they feel comfortable and confident they can enforce. And then the liability mitigation and response. I agree with Councilmember Lindstedt that we don't want to become the next case for other counties to be looking at, and other city councils. As far as the notification for cleanup, the public health hazard is, honestly, I think any amount of human waste or hypodermic needles around a tent is enough. Like that doesn't work well for the surrounding communities. And then the private property, I don't have a set time. I don't know what that looks like. It needs to be something that the individual whose property is communicated to them so that they know when and where they have to reclaim that, and not that it's 30 days and they can't even get back to get it. I don't know what that looks like, but something where it's not less based on time and more based on accessibility to that individual. So if they have the option to collect what they want. And expectations and communications. I think really what the hardest thing that the piece that needs to get communicated out to our residents the most is the case law. Like what are these defining pieces that are making this more cumbersome than we maybe think it needs to be, and so they understand what the confines, what we're working within. And I have nothing for relocation survival options. I forgot what that was too. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Nick. Okay, questions. What enforcement approach is preferred? I know there's some legal ambiguity, but my understanding of the current case law is that we cannot strictly enforce our code unless we have shelter options within Broomfield. We have established that we do not have shelter options within Broomfield. I would like, I think the police are asking for what they should do tomorrow. I mean, I think it's that immediate. I would like them to give a summons if we have that situation. I understand that there's a process with the summons that's involved that could get cumbersome. I understand that. I understand that there isn't a solution to put them in jail, but that's where I land at the moment. If we need an immediate answer for tomorrow. I'm with the understanding that the summons would not come until there was, what I understand is the relationship built that's already occurring, that you've already established. You've had a few encounters, you've given people a chance, then you give them a summons. That's where I land right now. In the long term, I would like the other shelter options explored further in the short term and the long term. I would like someone to come up with the public health the factors for determining the public health hazard. My gut is to go with if there's a lot of if there's waste and needles, like Councilmember Everett Anderson said, that's a public health hazard. But I would prefer that public health come up with that. I think it sounds like there's been a discussion of that. I would like to see that in the short term, very quickly, for our consideration. Yeah, and I think I addressed all that.
Can I ask you a question, Councilmember Lim? Because when you were talking about the summons, would it be like a summons for every case? Would it be a summons just for particular cases? Like, do you have an idea or?
The Councilmember Lim, if I may, Chief, would you help us understand the levels of engagement and what were how many engagements were there before you issued the summons? So if you've had multitude of engagements with homeless folks through the last 4 months and only issued one summons, what led to that one? What was it?
So there can be a lot of things. We have to look at the totality of it. And you know, we still are in the same legal environment. So we have to be a little conscious, but more importantly, I mean, we have to be a little bit humanistic as well with them. So usually we have a lot of issues. You know, for some, we're not really having a lot of problems. They are there. We know they're there. And they're not creating a lot of problems. In other cases, we've had other issues with them, whether we're getting complaints from stores from them. We've had disturbances with them and other area residents for whatever reason. Or it just becomes where they're at is such a problem. They need to move. And so that's really what we've been doing is pretty much a limited enforcement. I know there was something on the next door maybe about one of our officers said, well, we're waiting for counsel. That was, I apologize if that happened. I don't know if that conversation did or not, but if it did, I apologize. We needed to talk to you guys about just how complicated this is. And for the officers, we give them general direction. And Kurt, do you remember that summons and what the circumstances were?
Yeah. If memory serves, it was when the tent was pitched just south of the soccer field, but it was either between 9th and 10th or at 10th or at night, depending on which caller you talk to, right? And we were getting a lot of calls from people, and I suspect what happened was neighbors were talking to each other and said, I think the only thing we're ever gonna get this done is if we all start calling. So I sent our folks out there to evaluate and have a conversation. And they said that the accumulation of trash was growing. And I made a decision to have them write the summons and ask them to move on. And they did move on voluntarily, cleaned up and moved on. So that was really at my direction.
And did you see them again?
We saw them. So the individual I think that received that summons was female. Her and her son were displaced within the last year out of their apartments. They are now camping sort of in that Westlake area, Commons Park area. So we are seeing them, but they are moving and they are staying sort of, they're not giving us any trouble when we talk to them and kind of explain what we're looking at and kind of what we're dealing with. They're always very cooperative and they're willing to sort of move, but this is where they spent a lot of their life and this is where they're comfortable. So really for us, it's come down to just respectful conversations and take it from there, really.
Councilmember Lim, I don't know if that helps or not with regards to the levels of engagement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that level of engagement is appropriate in my estimation. And at this point, like I said, strict enforcement is not legally appropriate. It's even regardless of the ethical considerations. I don't think it's even legally appropriate right now, given what we've heard about the court cases. That's my thought.
Thank you. Before we go to the round three, I just wanted to add that a friend of mine whose son works at Taco Bell has coworkers that are unhoused. They work full-time at Taco Bell and they hang out in that area, sleep in cars where they can, which just reinforces the need for workforce housing at truly an affordable rate, because the $12 an hour they're making, working full-time, would never get them a place to live. Councilmember Evans.
Thank you, Mayor. So, and I do appreciate the going 3 rounds on this. This is my thoughts. I really appreciate the discussion. And one of the things that I wish we could do is I wish we could have this discussion around the table, because it's so much easier to see faces when we're having this. But nonetheless, I do appreciate the discussion. I am mindful of the incident that kind of brought this to the fore with that encampment that was in the Commons, you know, just on the other side of Sheridan. And I will say that I find it ironic that we're fulfilling the prophecy, as it were, here. We're about ready to direct staff to not strictly enforce the ordinance. And I'm not sure that's the right answer. I'm not sure that's the wrong answer, but I think we should be very, very mindful of that we, I don't know whether it's lawful or not. I don't think that's really the question. I think the question is we could wind up being sued. Nonetheless, that's the ordinance that's put in place. And if we're not going to modify the ordinance today, which we can't today, but very soon, I guess I do have a problem with not enforcing our current ordinance. So two questions, 2 asks of council, with all due respect, is I think we should have a straw poll. I'd like to request a straw poll specifically on the question of, do we strictly enforce the current ordinance today, backing our people, until we have a solution in place, realizing we're working towards a bigger solution, and realizing that might get us sued, but realizing that is the ordinance we have in place. And so that's my first request, is a straw poll. But my second request is, as we go through this, Manager Hoffman said that it's not necessarily about the money with this. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think it is, to a certain extent, about the money. We're certainly a very wealthy community. But for those of you who are kind of students of social history, and I pretend to be, when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're talking about the most basic level of the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And I would also say that representing Ward 1 down here in the southern part of the city, no disrespect to the northern wards intended, but there could easily be a time when the need to solve this very immediate problem that literally is life and death for certain people may outweigh the need for example, additional air quality monitoring going on to monitor a situation. We've got how many redundant systems up there? A situation that so far has proven to be basically under control, from what I understand. So just a thought. I guess my first question is the straw poll as to whether or not we're going to do the current enforcement, because I think we should all individually be on record for that, for our citizens. And second of all, I'd like us all to think about where the money's going to come from. So that's all I have, Mayor. That's my request. Thank you.
May I clarify the Councilmember Evans, because the levels of enforcement, there's different ones. There's the summons only, the limited enforcement, and the strict enforcement.
Understood. I guess thank you, Mayor, and I appreciate that very much. And what I understood Manager Hoffman saying is that she heard that there was not an appetite on council tonight for strict enforcement. And I guess I'd like to clarify that. I want to thin slice that, so the staff knows exactly what we want them to do.
We appreciate that. And Councilmember Evans, if I may, when I was referring to the cost of as no object, I was referring to what we'll bring back is not going, we'll have the cost attached, but we're not gonna enter into it with the options
from a cost prohibitive standpoint. That would be something for council to decide.
All right, well, Councilmember Groom raised her virtual hand. Councilmember Groom?
Yes, thank you. Hopefully, I'm coming across a little clearer now. I did want to provide a clarifying comment, and I have sent an email with my longer comments. But I too was concerned with the summary from the city manager Hoffman associated with us not enforcing our current codes and ordinances associated with this. And if my point was, or my opinions was not clear, I do, if we need to provide guidance for tomorrow, I do support issuing the 7-day summons notification and follow up with a 2-day notice of renewal, just like there was on the case in Denver. And I believe that, again, I have to look that up in my notes as I wrote them down, was a homeless out loud versus Denver established that. So, and then I do think we do need the phases, and that's what I've outlined in the email to council and staff. So thank you. That's all I had, Mayor.
Thank you. Mayor, can I make a clarification?
Yes, Ms. Rogers.
Councilmember Groom, on that case and for council, it was a 7-day notice to vacate the area. It wasn't a summons. It was a 7 days notice to vacate and then the opportunity to comply. And then there'd be potential enforcement action depending on the behavior of the individual. And then it was a 2 days notice if there was a significant public health risk because of whatever was on the property. So it wouldn't be a 7-day summons. I don't know if that changes your suggestion.
No, thank you for that clarification. The 7 days to vacate for the opportunity to comply. And then I didn't understand fully the 2 days. So thank you for that. That is 2 days in case there's a public health risk. On top of the 9, I'm sorry, on top of the 7.
No, I think it's in different situations that Denver was to give 7 days if it's your regular run of the mill camp, if you have a significant public health risk.
Oh, yes. So again, the clarity is very enlightening, and I support the 7 days to vacate for a regular encampment to provide an opportunity to comply. Of course, offering them the services that we have, and 2 days if there is a public health risk. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I do support the straw poll. But there you have my answer to that.
Thank you, Councilmember Groom. So do I just go down the dais? That was kind of a long, I was gonna go with the simple summons, limited enforcement, strict enforcement. I don't know how many combinations we can have. Help?
Yes, I would go down. So again, reiterating that right now in ordinance, it's a ban for camping. If the PD comes across a homeless person, Gary, help me out here.
I'll try. So, again, the ordinance only covers, and Nancy, make sure I'm right with this, parks and open space. So if we push them to your right of ways and they're along your sidewalks, not down here on First Avenue and all that, that might be an outcome of where we push them to. For what it's worth, I don't think we have to go this far tonight. I think we're managing this okay for now. And we can, and we'll listen to the citizens and make determination. It's totally up to you, your council, and we'll follow your direction. But for what it's worth, with a legal
and potential other outcomes, it might be okay, and we would be fine with it for now. I think it's bringing this conversation of now what we do once we have an option and then moving that more forward.
Yeah, so I apologize. So again, it was the continue to handle it the way that the way that PD is handling it right now. So essentially status quo until we come back with further options was collectively what I was hearing.
I get it.
However, a straw poll is certainly specifying what that direction is. If so, I guess, Mayor, for those that are our current handling of this situation from an enforcement perspective, as is, until we come back with additional options.
Oh, just hand raise, so to, until September.
No, I mean, we can, I'm looking at Abby and Danae, again, other than that special, we literally, your count, you all are packed until beginning of October. So it would have to be a special meeting. But again, from an emergency task force conversation, we can probably do that in 3 weeks.
Now we have a whole nother straw poll, is who's going to agree to another special meeting. We've had so many. We've not had a break.
And that's, again, that it's council's, staff will continue to work on the items. We can bring this back to you for options on September 7th, or we can have a special meeting. And the straw poll is really continuing with the enforcement methodology that we have right now until either a special meeting or the meeting on September 7th.
Okay.
Current and status quo with how PD is handling the situation right now.
Okay. Okay, question?
I'm sorry, so right now the PD is doing limited enforcement. That's what we're currently doing, that's the question, to continue doing limited enforcement. My follow-up is, right now the shelters are at capacity and it's warm weather. We're gonna have a much bigger problem in the fall when things get cold, like we always do.
Mm-hmm.
So are we gonna be able to have that discussion before we get there?
So we can either have a special meeting or we can have a follow-up conversation with specifics on September 7th.
Okay, I don't know, I mean, September 7th seems, it's a little, that's tight turnaround before the weather turns, so those are my thoughts.
Okay, back to the poll.
Okay, so first question first.
Okay.
All of those that are comfortable with the current application of enforcement that the PD has been utilizing up until this point.
That's 6. Kim, what's your vote? Are you raising your hand?
My vote is enforcement now.
That wasn't like that. So that's not.
So I
So
don't know
again,
how to.
Kind of straw poll would be six council members said yes, continue with that enforcement. So, and again, I am here to serve you, so I'm just trying to walk through. So Councilmember Schaaf and Councilmember Groom would like to go in a different direction, in some other direction other than maintain status quo. until the follow-up meeting. So Mayor, your,
That's a
majority. That said, if we could get some direction tonight, so we wouldn't have to follow it up again, on whether we wait until the existing, already scheduled follow-up meeting on September 7th, or would council prefer to direct staff to have, not a philosophical conversation, but more of a detailed conversation about short-term fixes within the next 3 weeks to a month.
Raise your hand if you're okay. No question? Question from Lyman. Councilmember Lyman.
So if, as we do that,
Yes.
I would just request that, I know Abby's taking great notes, she always does. I would request that as you bring things back to us, let's start off with a package as a discrete package. And then if council has specific twists and turns they want to put out, that's fine, but let's start from a package that you heard tonight. Am I making sense? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Tell me just a little bit more, just, I
Okay,
just
so-
want to be absolutely
So
sure.
the options that you would bring back to us, based on all the different thoughts that you heard tonight,
Yes.
I'd like you to put a box around. it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, yes,
Because-
yes.
Because this has been very helpful from a philosophical standpoint, from an implementation standpoint, this meeting's been a train wreck, let's just face it. Right? From an implementation standpoint, we're all over. it. So I'd like you to
Yeah.
take that and box it up for us.
Yep.
And if we change it, that's one thing, but start out from a discrete DISC or ETE, not EET.
Got it. Yeah, that's where we live, so that works for us.
Yep.
Everybody was all over the place and the notes.
Yeah, that's.
Councilmember, you had a question?
Yeah, and it might be just more of a comment. I actually think this was a great conversation, and as much as it was messy, I feel like I got a great understanding as to what you guys are dealing with. And you know, how our community feels, and just sort of the care that you're taking in each individual person. And that really means a lot to not only council, but our people. A lot of people really care that you're taking an individualistic approach, and we can't box it into strict enforcement. We can't box it into specific types of enforcement because people are different and their situations are different. And it's a health and human hazard. I mean, right? Like these are issues that we're dealing with, but every situation is different. So as much as it was messy, I think we landed on a humanistic approach. And in 3 weeks, this is an ongoing situation, and I feel like it's like an emergency situation, and I feel like we should at least have this conversation in 3 weeks, but we don't have enough carrots to give a stick. That's how I view it. We have carrots to move around, which is great, but the carrot needs to be that, hey, Broomfield, we care about you. That's what this message needs to be, and we're willing to step up to do so. So I don't know what that conversation will look like in 3 weeks, and I don't want to put any pressure on anyone to have any sort of like immediate plan necessarily, but at least what does that conversation look like? Who would we talk to? And who's responding, and how can we respond in kind to support our neighbors who are also going through the same things? Thanks.
To be continued. Thank you all for your contributions to this critical conversation. And we're going to head to a little break in our executive session next. You have everything you need? 10 minutes.
Yes, and what we'll do is we will, so our team is debriefing, Mayor, to Councilmember Law Evans' point, taking the emotions and philosophical pieces out of it.
Yes.
We'll have the various components that we're following up on in an email, and kind of just piecemealing that out, and that can also be shared with the public so that they are fully aware of what the next steps are, rather than waiting 3 weeks to get the agenda for the next special meeting.
Sounds good.
Thank you all.
All right, thank you all very much.